The morning of November 3rd, 2025, Nepal's Rolwalling Valley, the base camp of Mount Yalung Ri, an altitude of 4,900 meters. 15 people are getting ready for a routine acclimatization outing. In a few minutes, the camp will no longer exist. A layer of snow and rocks 6 meters deep will cover the tents almost instantly. Inside one of them is a 69-year-old Frenchman, Christian André Manfredi, a seasoned mountaineer on his 5th trip to the Himalayas. Right next to him is his wife. She will survive, he will not. The words she speaks from a hospital bed will become the key to this entire story. And the main question is, why help took a full day to arrive? Puget-Théniers is a small commune in the Alpes-Maritimes in southeastern France. It's less than an hour's drive from the Mediterranean, but mountains surround you on every side. The gorge of the Var River, stone walls, narrow trails, old villages clinging to the slopes. This is where, in the middle of the 20th century, Christian André Manfredi is born. For him, the mountains are never just a picture on a calendar. From the very start, they're his everyday surroundings. In Puget-Théniers live people who can read the weather by the shape of the clouds over the ridge. They know when the meltwater will come down, when you shouldn't head into the gorge, where an avalanche cone might settle in winter. A childhood in a place like this shapes a very particular language, a language of snow, stone, and the silence before the storm. From his youth, Christian learns this language the way other children learn their multiplication tables. The Alpes-Maritimes are the cradle of French mountaineering and alpine tourism. Right next door is the Mercantour, a national park with 4,000-meter peaks. Further north, the Great Alpine Routes. Christian most likely does his first climbs right here, with friends, with local clubs. He gets used to crampons, ice axes, to the rhythm of long approaches. It's not yet an expedition, but it's already a school. The people of Puget-Théniers will later describe him very simply. One of our own, grew up on our slopes, was this way for as long as anyone can remember. To them, Christian isn't a man who one day left for the mountains. He's a man who never stepped out of them. This early habit of altitude becomes the foundation of his entire biography. On top of it will be laid years of mountaineering practice, dozens of routes, 5 expeditions in the Himalayas. And on top of it will also be laid the finale of the story, an autumn slope in a valley far from home, where the language of snow he learned as a child will no longer have time to whisper anything to him. Christian learns the language of the mountains first, but in parallel he studies another, the language of documents, regulations, and public administration. After school, he leaves for Paris and enters Sciences Po, the Institute of Political Studies, one of the most prestigious schools in France. It produces ministers, prefects, senior officials. For a kid from an alpine village, that's a big leap, but Christian doesn't stay in the capital. He brings his Sciences Po diploma back with him to the Alpes-Maritimes and begins his career at the bottom of the local administration. His first position, secretary of the town hall. Paperwork, records, minutes, the budget of a small commune. The kind of work that's considered dull in big cities, but is the backbone of everything in mountain regions. Without it, the villages simply don't function. He moves up, step by step. He becomes general secretary of the municipality, then takes the same position in a community of communes. In 2010, he helps create SMEDI, the Mixed Syndicate for Waste Disposal of the Alpes-Maritimes. It's an intermunicipal body responsible for collecting and processing waste for an entire region. Not a glamorous subject, but a vital one. Christian becomes General Director of SMED Services, and later, Technical Director. His job is to design logistical schemes, negotiate with the communes, build a system that runs without glitches. His administrative colleagues will later say he tackled office problems with the same methodical approach he once used to climb alpine walls. The same character, just in different settings. All the while, he never sets the mountains aside, not for a single year. Weekends, vacations, long summer routes in the Alps, ice pairs in the off-season, office during the week, a wall on Saturday. The two lines run in parallel for decades, and the longer it goes on, the clearer it becomes that the big lofty goal he keeps in mind lies not in France. That lofty goal is Nepal. Already in his mature years, Christian travels to the Himalayas and comes back with an entirely different scale in his head. 7,000-meter peaks, glaciers, base camps at 4,500 meters, trekking trails and deep valleys. None of it resembles the Alps Maritimes, or even the major alpine routes. This is the next level, and he takes it on. Manfredi travels to Nepal several times, combining trekking with technical climbs. He isn't chasing commercial 8,000ers or flashy records. His format is 5,000 and 6,000-meter peaks in lesser-known regions in small groups with a reliable guide. In style, it's closer to classical European mountaineering than to the global Everest industry. By 2025, he already has 4 expeditions in the Nepalese mountains behind him. Each one means several weeks at altitude, acclimatization, glacier crossings, long days in base camp. That kind of familiarity with the Himalayas doesn't come quickly, and by 69, he has something many of his peers simply don't: his own first-hand experience of several seasons in high-altitude conditions. Always by his side is the same partner. His wife, Isabelle Solange Thion. She is 54, herself a seasoned mountaineer. The mountain has long since stopped being the private hobby of one spouse. It's a shared distance, a joint project, a way of life. They prepare for each trip together and discuss it the way an ordinary family discusses a vacation, only with maps and weather charts. The 5th expedition is planned seriously. The main goal is Dolma Khang, a 6,000-meter peak standing at 6,334 meters in the same eastern Nepalese district. It requires preliminary acclimatization, and not just on paper, but for real. As the acclimatization peak, they choose a relatively modest neighbor, Yalung Ri, 5,630 meters in the adjacent Rolwaling Valley. On paper, Yalung Ri looks nearly perfect as a warm-up mountain, a summit of 5,630 meters, a relatively short route, an easy approach. In the Nepalese classification, the mountain is listed as a trekking peak, a summit you can climb under a simplified permit scheme through the Nepal Mountaineering Association, with less bureaucracy than a real major peak. Because of that status, Yalung Ri is often marketed in agency catalogs as an accessible 5,000er. The wording is misleading. In practice, the route demands the full mountaineering kit: crampons, ice axe, rope work, the ability to move in a rope team over a covered glacier, and an understanding of the avalanche situation. This isn't a tourist outing. This is real alpinism in miniature. The terrain itself isn't easy either. The approach to base camp starts from the village of Na Gaon, which sits at 4,180 meters. From there to the camp at 4,900 meters, it's about 4 hours of steep traversing over snow and scree. That's already serious physical work, especially during acclimatization. Base camp itself is pitched on a gentle shelf at the foot of Yalung Ri's slopes, between glaciers, below the collapse zone. All around is the Rolwaling Valley. In Nepal, it's officially classified as a restricted zone. That means any flight in the area is regulated by several agencies at once: the Ministry of Tourism, the Civil Aviation Authority, the Ministry of Defense, and the Ministry of the Interior. You can't just lift off a helicopter and fly in. You need clearance, and that clearance takes time. On a good day, it doesn't get in anyone's way. On a bad day, this is exactly what adds extra hours between the call for help and its arrival. As of 2025, few climbers give these details any thought. Yalung Ri is perceived as an easy mountain. The gap between easy paperwork and heavy real-world terrain is invisible from the outside. It will show itself later. That gap between paperwork and reality feels especially sharp in the fall of 2025. After long post-COVID years and several difficult seasons, the Himalayan expedition industry is on the rise again. Nepalese operators are bringing in large international groups. On the classic trekking peaks, you now see not only beginners, but seasoned older climbers who have been putting this trip off for years. On Dolma Khang that autumn, a mixed expedition is coming together. It's organized by 2 well-known Nepalese operators, 7 Summit Treks and Dreamers Destination. It's not a small private group, but a full-scale enterprise with a base camp, a line of fixed ropes, logistics from Kathmandu, and a team of experienced high-altitude workers. The project leader is Purba Tenjing Sherpa, 17-time summiter of Everest. For him, Dolma Khang isn't the toughest challenge. It's standard work he takes on with his regular crew. The climbing leader is Nima Gyaljan Sherpa, another experienced Nepalese high-altitude guide responsible for technical decisions on the slope. In total, the group numbers around 15 people, among them 5 foreign clients and 10 Nepalese high-altitude workers, guides, cooks, porters, assistants. A typical ratio for a modern Himalayan expedition. Foreigners pay for the service and the route. Nepalis shoulder the lion's share of the physical work. Among the foreigners, a mixed bunch. A few Italians, a German, a Canadian participant, and a small French subgroup led by Christian Manfredi. With him are his wife, Isabelle Théon, and 2 other French mountaineers, Didier Armand and Carol Fuchs. On the formal paperwork, part of the French group runs through a separate operator, Yatri Treks, but on the ground they walk in the same flow, live in the same base camp, and use the same infrastructure. All of these people meet up in Kathmandu, in the guest houses, the agency offices, at the final briefings. None of them yet know that their names will end up in the same report. The Kathmandu meeting takes place against a backdrop of worrying weather bulletins. At the end of October 2025, Cyclone Mantha is spinning up over southern Asia. It forms in the Bay of Bengal, makes landfall on the Indian coast, and slowly turns its tail toward the Himalayas. For Nepal, that means one thing: several days in a row of heavy precipitation. Western and central Nepal are hit with snowfall, rain in the valleys, dense snow higher up. Low cloud cover, poor visibility. The local guides know what an October-November cyclone in the mountains means. It's not just bad weather, it's a fast dump of massive amounts of snow onto autumn slopes that haven't yet stabilized. The Roll-Wailing Valley gets its share of wind and precipitation. For several days it lives inside a thick shroud. The summits are hidden, the trail is drifted over in places, the villages on the approaches are cut off from the classic routes. For the people heading to Yalung Ri base camp, this means a pause. They have to wait for the sky to open up at least partially. The snow cover on the slopes around Yalung Ri quickly becomes overloaded. A fresh layer is added, and then another, and another. The wind shapes this mass into snow slabs, dense plates sitting on weaker, looser layers underneath. For avalanche conditions, that's the most dangerous scenario imaginable. The mountain in this state is like a cocked trigger. The group lingers in the lower villages. Reports come in, forecasts are double-checked, timings are debated. The autumn season in the Himalayas is short. Winter is already right behind November, and you can't push the schedule any later. Lower temperatures, shorter daylight, higher risk of frostbite. Every lost day is one less day out of the total window. On November 2nd, a break appears in the weather. For a few hours, the cloud cover thins out and the snowfall eases. The expedition leadership decides to use the window and move up to base camp. The logic is standard. Catch the short plateau, anchor yourselves higher up. Start the acclimatization work. Sound logic for a normal season. This season is no longer normal. The decision to use the weather window kicks off the whole logistics chain. The night before, on the night of November 1st to 2nd, the group sleeps in the village of Nagaon at 4,180 meters. It's the last point of real housing before base camp. Stone houses, a communal tea house, simple food, kerosene lamps. An ordinary last night at shelter kind of evening before heading to altitude. Christian Manfredi and his wife Isabelle walk in one of the rope teams. They know the rhythm of preparation, packing the rucksacks, rearranging personal gear, checking crampons and straps. Right beside them are the other 2 French climbers, Didier Armand and Carol Fuchs. They're also doing their final equipment check. Everyone has known each other for several days now. Enough time to talk, share experiences, swap personal stories. In the larger column are the Italians Paolo Cocco, Marco Di Marcello, Marcus Kirchler, and others. The German, Jakob Schreiber. The Nepalese guides Mira Karki and Padam Tamang. A whole team of high-altitude workers, 15 people, each with their own pack and their own role. The leaders go over the route and departure time one more time. On the morning of November 2nd, the group climbs up from Nagaon. The trail runs along a steep snow traverse, winds between moraines, and opens onto an easy glacier. In normal conditions, it's a 4-hour crossing that makes you sweat, but isn't considered technically difficult. With fresh snow on the ground, every step takes more effort. At 4,900 meters, the team reaches base camp. Tents go up on a relatively flat shelf at the foot of Yalung Ri's slopes. A moraine is nearby, and a bit higher, the glacial cirque. A classic setup. A site just inside the zone sheltered from obvious hanging seracs, but still within direct reach of possible avalanche paths from above. Despite the temporary clearing, the guides notice troubling signs. The snow settles under their feet with a characteristic sound, a low boom. That's the settling of a snow slab, the classic precursor to an avalanche release. The discussions are kept low-key. The decision: spend the night in camp, acclimatize in the morning, behave quietly and attentively. Overnight, the wind gradually dies down. The night passes without incident, and that creates the deceptive feeling that the hardest part is already behind them. The morning of November 3rd, 2025, begins like any other day of a big expedition. It's around 8 in the morning. The camp gradually comes to life. Tea is being made, water is warming up, snack packs are being opened. Someone steps out of a tent, looks toward the summit, notices that the cloud cover is thickening. 8:30. Not everyone inside the tents is ready yet. Some are drinking something hot. Others are repacking rucksacks for a short acclimatization outing to the nearest slope. One person checks crampons, another fiddles with headlamp batteries. Nima Gyaljan Sherpa coordinates the start. The usual calm rhythm of camp life at altitude. And at that moment, high above the camp, a huge mass breaks loose. It isn't a pretty powder plume, not the classic avalanche you can see coming. It's a heavy front of snow and rock moving down the steep slope straight at the tent area. A snow slab, overloaded by the previous day's precipitation, comes off as one entire sheet. The people in the camp have no time. Seconds between the first sound and the moment the wave covers everything living. Tents are crushed, poles snap, gear is swept downhill. The layer of snow and rock that remains on the camp is at least 6 meters thick. For those caught in the center of the impact, it leaves almost no chance at all. Christian Manfredi's tent is in the main avalanche field. As his wife will later tell it, the impact comes almost immediately, in the very first seconds. The light fabric of the tent, the down jacket, the small space, none of it can hold back the dense mass. He has no chance, not in that moment, and not later either. Along with him, several other people end up beneath the layer of snow. For some, help will no longer be needed. Others are still fighting. Silence settles over the camp again, but beneath that silence, life is still going on. Beneath that silence, several pockets of life. Part of the camp ended up to the side of the main flow. Isabelle Taillon and Didier Armand had pitched their tent slightly to the left of the main impact zone. That small shift, random when setting up, becomes for them the difference between life and death. The flow passes to the right, taking out the main mass of tents, and the two of them are only struck by the edge wave. Later, from her hospital bed in Kathmandu, Isabelle will find simple words. "We were lucky," she'll say. "We were on the left." In that one line, you get all the randomness of an avalanche at once. It wasn't them who decided to pitch the tent there. They just happened, in the moment of the release, to be 3 meters away from the line beyond which there's almost no chance left. They're tossed, carried, flipped over. They vault over rocks, shielding their faces with their elbows, paddling their arms in the snow like in icy water. That's not a figure of speech, but an actual survival technique. In the flow, you have to keep your head up, paddle, try not to go under the upper layer. When the movement stops, they're still on the surface, alive, injured, but breathing. Around them, shouts, sparse, muffled, then the creaking of settling mass, then a long, viscous silence. The camp as an organized space ceases to exist in a single minute. Where 10 minutes earlier there had been tents, a kitchen, a passageway between awnings, there is now a flat snowfield with wreckage sticking out. Those who weren't crushed outright get to work. Bare hands, ice axes, broken aluminum poles. They dig out the nearest people, call out, listen. The wounded are dragged to the surviving tents on the edge of the camp. People try to warm them, inject painkillers from the first aid kits. Communication with the outside world is only the guide's satellite phone and radio. Through the satellite goes the distress signal, Yalung Ri base camp, mass avalanche, many dead and injured, urgent evacuation needed. On the other end of the line, the office in Kathmandu, and beyond that, hours of waiting. Above Rollwalling, a gray, impenetrable sky. The distress signal goes down fast, but help is not in any hurry to move up. The helicopters of private Kathmandu companies physically cannot take off. Heavy snowfall, thick cloud cover, zero visibility in the valley. To fly into terrain like this, the pilot needs to see reference points, and on this day, there are none. On top of the weather comes the second barrier: bureaucracy. Raw whaling is officially classified as a restricted zone in Nepal. Flying there requires that same multi-step chain of approvals. On an ordinary day, this scheme works as a boring ritual. Today, it costs time that can't be recovered. While paperwork is being approved on the ground, up top, the hours keep ticking. The wounded in the camp wait. There are few medications, little warmth, even less strength. The full day passes like one long, frozen morning. Carol Fuchs will later put what she went through in plain terms. Help came late, due to administrative issues with flight clearances in the restricted zone and deteriorating weather. Her words are picked up by the Nepalese mountain guides. One of them, IFMGA instructor Mingma Gyabu, posts a sharp statement on social media that will later go around the international press. In his version, responsibility for the 7 climbers lies not only with the avalanche, but also with the system that kept help from arriving in time. You can dissect that position point by point for a long time. The simple fact is this: in a mountain system where hours decide everything, any extra bureaucracy works against the ones waiting for help. By the evening of the next day, the weather window finally opens. The first helicopters lift off into the valley and begin evacuating the wounded. 4 injured Nepalese high-altitude workers and several foreigners fly out on the first run to Kathmandu. Isabel Thaon is among the evacuees, with bruises, hypothermia, and a concussion. Christian Manfredi's body is pulled out from under the snow on the very first day of the ground operation. He is dug out by local guides who arrived with the first group of rescuers. The helicopter takes him out along with one of the Italians. The flight heads for the capital. A few more bodies remain in the camp, unreachable for now. In Kathmandu, Manfredi's body is delivered to teaching hospital for a post-mortem examination. It's a standard procedure: establishing the cause, drawing up documents for the French consulate, preparing for repatriation. At the same time, the bodies of other foreigners are brought in nearby. Doctors, officials, and diplomats from several countries work in the mode of one big bulletin. In France, the news arrives a few hours later. First, short agency feeds: avalanche on Yalung Ri in Nepal, French citizens among the dead. Then details. One of them is Christian Manfredi, born in Puget-Théniers, who worked for years in the local administration. For the Alps Maritimes, this isn't some abstract foreigner who died somewhere far away. This is one of our own. The mayor of the commune addresses the residents briefly and soberly. For our village, this is a real shock. The colleagues at ESMED publish their own statement. In it, Christian is a methodical man, devoted to his work, who helped build up the syndicate from its founding in 2010, and rose through all the ranks, from General Director of Services to Technical Director. In the Federation of Elected Officials of Local Enterprises, he's called the Man of Two Worlds, the office and the mountains. The French press puts it differently. The headlines carry a phrase that will be repeated across many publications. He fell victim to his passion for the mountains. He was 69 years old, and he was heading to his 5th expedition in the Himalayas, full of strength and plans. His family emphasizes this. This was a man for whom mountains weren't a retirement whim. They were a part of who he was. On November 5th, 2 bodies are officially transported to Kathmandu. IFMGA guides take part in the operation, climbing up with additional equipment. Several more bodies remain on the slope. On November 7th, 2025, the rescue services make a difficult decision. The official search is called off. 5 bodies remain under the snow and rocks of Yalung Ri, in that same 6-meter layer that buried the camp. For the relatives, this decision becomes a second loss. This second loss for the families folds into a wider context. The disaster of November 3rd becomes part of a series of events that will be named, in international reports, the Nepal snow disaster of 2025. In those same days, on another mountain, Panbari Himal, another avalanche comes down, and it has its own dead climbers. The combined death toll over a short stretch of time passes 9 people. In response, a discussion opens in the global specialist press about the safety of trekking peaks. A simple question: how did it happen that, on an accessible mountain, 7 people in a single group died? The answer turns out to be complicated. The formal permit category creates in climbers and in operators a sense of managed risk. On the ground, there is no managed risk. A separate topic: the rescue system in restricted zones, like roll whaling. The requirement for permits from several ministries has political and military grounds, but in the moment of a mass tragedy, it turns into an additional risk factor. After Yalung Ri, voices in Nepal start calling for a review of the rules on emergency flights in restricted zones. Whether anything actually moves in practice is a question for future seasons. Isabelle Théon returns to France. She gradually recovers from the bruises and the hypothermia. But the main thing is that she is alone after decades in which the mountain was a shared project. Her testimony is one of the few direct sources on what exactly happened in the camp that morning. Without her words, the picture of events would be noticeably poorer. In Puget-Théniers, Christian-André Manfredi is remembered as a man of two worlds. The SMED office with its folders, waste collection schedules, and meetings, and the Nepalese base camp with the smell of kerosene, wool hats, and the morning light over roll whaling. Two completely different stages, which he knew how to combine. Among all the tragedies of the fall of 2025, it's his story that stands out as one of the most recent and most telling. An experienced older mountaineer, strong, prepared, in good shape, and one morning in which all of that stops mattering. For 40 years, he pulled people off these walls. Dozens of times he rode the rescue helicopter cable down to climbers who had fallen in the Dolomites. And on the 17th of September, 2025, he fell himself, just a few dozen meters from the summit of Cima Grande di Lavaredo, on a route he knew by heart. Franco Gaspari, 64 years old, from Cortina d'Ampezzo, one of the first technicians of the Italian SUEM, a member of the famous Scoiattoli group, former president of the Guides College. What happened on the ledge just below the summit, no one saw. His partners only felt the rope pulling, but in the wrong direction. This is the story of a man who knew the mountains like no one else, and still didn't come back. Franco Gaspari is born in 1961 in Cortina d'Ampezzo, a small town in the heart of the Italian Dolomites. This is a place where the mountains are never just scenery. Ampezzo is a narrow valley, ringed by the sheer walls of the Tofane, Croda del Lago, Sorapis, and Civetta. For centuries, climbers have come here from all across Europe, and for centuries, local families have led them upward. Whole dynasties of guides have grown up here: De Bona, Di Mai, Apollonio, Lacedelli, surnames that would have become legends elsewhere, but in Cortina remain neighbors across the street. Little Franco grows up among these walls. He watches the daily flights of rescue helicopters over the valley, gray specks drifting above the spires, and the taut cable at the end of which a man descends. He listens to the older guides in the cafe on the main square. Their conversations are not about heroic feats, but about routes, weather, clients. The mountains around them are not poetry and not tourism. They are a workplace where fathers and grandfathers earn their living, grow tired, and sometimes die. Another crucial detail shapes him from childhood: his membership in the Regole d'Ampezzo. This is the most ancient communal institution of the valley, existing since the early Middle Ages. The Regole collectively manage the pastures and forests of the Ampezzo Basin, and membership is passed down by bloodline. For a boy from Cortina, this means one thing: the land he walks on belongs neither to the state nor to the hotels. It belongs to his family and to the families of his neighbors. In such an environment, the choice is never made separately. Here, the mountains either become your profession, or they release you completely, and you leave for the cities of the lowlands. Franco does not leave. By the time he is 15, he already moves along the walls around his home as if they were an extension of his own yard. For Cortina, this is not an exception, but the norm. And from this very norm, a few years later, will grow one of the most respected figures in Italian mountain rescue. It is from this very norm that Franco steps onto his first real walls. In his youth, he enters the circle of the Scoiattoli di Cortina, the Squirrels of Cortina. This is a legendary group of local climbers, founded in 1939. The Scoiattoli are not a club you join on a whim. This is a closed brotherhood, and only strong climbers native to Ampezzo are admitted. The red sweater with the squirrel patch is worn by only a handful of men, and each of them is known by name throughout the valley. Standing before the young Franco in this group are names already written into the history of Italian climbing. Lino Lacidelli, who summited K2 in 1954, the Alvera brothers, openers of grade 6 routes on the Tofana and the Marmolada, Bruno Ghibella, one of the most tenacious climbers of his generation. Being accepted among them means being taken not into a sports club, but into a bloodline. Franco goes through what every Cortina climber is required to go through, the classics of the Dolomites. The Comici route on the north face of Cima Grande, famous for its overhanging terrain, the Debona di Hadral on Tofana, the walls of the Cinque Torri, small towers where pure climbing technique is honed. He climbs without display, without shouting, without any showy bravery. This is the style of the old-school Cortina guides: precise movement, economy of effort, a minimum of words. Gradually, he begins taking on clients and preparing for the exam to become a Guida Alpina. In Italy, this is the main professional mountain license. Without it, you cannot legally lead people for money. The exam is brutal. Climbing technique, ice technique, avalanche training, rescue in a rope team, medicine, teaching. Franco passes it in the early 80s. By the mid-80s, people in the valley no longer speak of him as a promising youth, but as a young and reliable guide. He works on rock without mistakes. His speech is calm. His hands are steady. For Ampezzo, these are the most valued qualities in a man entrusted with other people's lives. And it is precisely this reputation that leads him to the next door. That door opens in 1985. Franco Gaspari joins the Soccorso Alpino, the Italian Mountain Rescue Service, part of the national organization CNSAS. He enrolls in the Cortina unit, one of the busiest in all of the Italian Alps. The 80s are a time when Italy is rebuilding its entire system of mountain rescue from the ground up. Before that, help had to climb up on foot from below, for hours, often arriving too late. Now, helicopters appear. Cortina finds itself at the center of this process. The local SUEM, Servizio Urgenza Emergenza Medica, begins regular flights of rescue machines, Falco and Leone, based in Pieve di Cadore. These are specialized helicopters with a doctor and a rescue technician on board, capable of working in narrow couloirs and over sheer walls. Gaspari becomes one of the first helicopter rescue technicians of this service. For him, this means a new profession inside a profession. The work of a rescue technician is arranged like this. A signal comes into the dispatch room, the machine takes off within minutes, and after 20 or 30 minutes of flight, it is already hovering above the site of the call. Then comes the moment for which the whole thing was invented. The technician descends on the cable to a person on a wall, in a glacier crevasse, on a ledge above an abyss. He must assess the situation, secure the victim, give the signal. The helicopter holds position. The pilot fights with wind and air pockets, and the technician is the link between the machine and the ground. Through the 80s and 90s, Gaspari takes part in dozens of operations. The Tofane, Sorapis, Civetta, and the Tre Cime di Lavaredo themselves. All these walls become his working grounds. He brings back those who can still be saved, and those who no longer need help. This is the everyday side of the job, the side you don't talk about at the dinner table, but which accumulates inside you. For the Ampezzo Valley, Franco becomes part of the invisible network that lifts people off the mountains. This network will keep running for all the next 40 years of his life. 40 years? This is not a figure of speech in Gaspari's biography, but a literal unit of measurement. From 1985 to 2025, he remains one of the pillars of CNSAS in Cortina. No one keeps an exact count of the operations he took part in, but in the Ampezzo service, his name is tied to an entire era, from the earliest helicopter models to modern machines with thermal imagers, from paper call logs to digital coordinates on a tablet. In summer, the work goes on without pause. The helicopter takes off several times a day. Tourists who have fallen on the Via Ferrata around Tofana di Roses, climbers caught in a thunderstorm on the walls of the Cinque Torri, people who have twisted an ankle on the trails to Lake Serapis and can no longer walk. Winter brings a different set of call-outs. avalanches in Fan Sen, frostbite on ski touring routes, frozen skiers who have gone off-piste. Franco works both as a technician on board and as a ground rescuer, the one who goes on foot when the helicopter can't reach. He trains the younger men who enter the service in the 2000s. His way of passing on experience is the same as on the wall: short, precise instructions, a minimum of theory, a maximum of practice side by side. Colleagues describe him without exaggeration: calm, focused, without any showy bravery. This is the typical imprint of a mountain rescue veteran. A man who understands that heroism in their line of work means not some beautiful gesture, but bringing the entire team home. Such men never have epic stories to tell after a shift. What they do have is a reputation, one that builds on its own over the years. For the community of Ampezzo, Gaspari gradually turns into a figure people come to for advice. How to run a difficult operation in a narrow couloir of the Tofan. How to get onto the wall of Cima Ovest in bad weather, which belay anchors are reliable on an old route from the 1930s. These consultations are written down nowhere, but it is precisely they that make a man not just a rescuer, but a bearer of the craft. Parallel to this craft runs another. From that same year, 1985, Gaspari works as a mountain guide taking paying clients. 40 years of experience, a figure rarely seen in the Italian climbing community. He joins the association guide Alpine Cortina, one of the oldest climbing schools in Italy, with roots reaching into the 19th century, back to the first guides who worked with English aristocrats. At a certain point in his career, he is elected president of the Cortina Guides College. In a closed professional community, this is a special honor. The post is not decorative. The president is responsible for admitting new guides, for training standards, for negotiations with the resort administration and with the National Association. He also represents the college in conflicts, and in a tourist region there is no shortage of those, from disputes over climbing crags to reviews of accidents. As a guide, Gaspari leads clients on the classics of the Dolomites: Cima Grande, Via Normale, the small towers of the Cinque Torri, convenient for teaching; Punta Fiames, the first objective for many beginners; the routes on the Tofane, familiar to him since his youth. He prefers classic lines, not out of laziness or conservatism. His position is simpler. A guide has no right to risk another person's life for the sake of his own ambition. A client who is paid for an ascent is paying for safety and for the summit, not for extreme sport. Among his clients he has a particular reputation: few words, precise in his movements, giving on the wall that feeling of total safety, which is valued above technical tricks. People who have climbed with him once come back again. Many write to him for years, booking routes in advance for the summer season. Woven into this same fabric of work is teaching. Franco runs courses for young guides and for members of the rescue service. He teaches not climbing, that they learn on their own, but those invisible little things that separate a craftsman from an amateur: how to talk to a frightened client, how to make the decision to turn back in bad weather, how to lay out your gear so you can find the right carabiner with your eyes closed. These invisible little things Gaspari also begins to deposit in another place: in books. Alongside his work on the walls, he goes into the archives, and here, another side of this man opens up. A historian of the Dolomites, something few would expect to find in a mountain guide. He becomes a recognized expert on the history of the valley. Several layers interest him at once: the First World War, during which Cortina and the neighboring valleys were the front line between Italy and Austria-Hungary; the Dolomites Railway, a vanished narrow-gauge line that connected Calalzo di Cadore and Dobbiaco, famous for its viaducts and tunnels; the lives of Ampezzo guides of the 19th and 20th centuries, men whose surnames today are inscribed on memorial plaques, but about whom little is known in detail. In 2016, together with Carlo Gandini, he publishes the monograph Antonio Di Maideo, Una Famiglia di Guide Alpine. The book comes out from the Gruppo Scoiattoli publishing house. It is devoted to the Di Mai dynasty, one of the most famous names among Cortina guides. The Di Mai's worked with Austrian and English clients, opened routes on Tofana di Rosis, on the Croda di Misurina, and made first ascents on the Tre Cime. Antonio Di Maideo is the key figure of this line, a guide of the late 19th and early 20th century. The work on the book requires months of searching: parish registers in the Cortina church archives, expedition diaries held by descendants, Old photographs with clients from England and Germany, yellowed, with captions in 3 languages. Gaspari gathers all of this himself, sitting personally at a table in a sacristy, or in the private homes of descendants. In a 2016 interview with Corriere delle Alpi, he formulates his position. Cortina must have its own mountain museum. He sees the valley as a place that is gradually forgetting its own artisan history for the sake of winter resort glamour. His lectures and publications make him not just a rescuer, but an institution, a figure connecting physical work on the walls with the cultural memory of the valley. This role as an institution extends far beyond books. Gaspari is deeply embedded in the life of Cortina as a community. He sits on the municipal council of the commune, the town assembly where questions of tourism, nature protection, budgets, and infrastructure are decided. For an international-level ski resort, where dozens of hotels and lifts operate summer and winter, this is a constant workload. Discussions last for hours, and you have to understand the numbers, the laws, the zoning regulations. At the same time, he is a member of the Regole d'Ampezzo. This is the ancient communal structure that has managed the pastures and forests of Ampezzo since the early Middle Ages. To an outside observer, both titles might seem decorative. To the people of Ampezzo themselves, it is a mark of a completely different order. Membership means that a person belongs to the core of the valley, that his family line reaches deep into local history. Gaspari speaks at sessions on the topics he knows better than anyone: mountain tourism, route safety, oversight of the Via Ferrata, relations with the alpine clubs. When yet another contested project is being discussed, a new cable car, the widening of a trail, a change of access to the walls, his voice carries particular weight. He is hard to accuse of bias. He is not a businessman and not a politician, but a man who knows every stone within a 20-kilometer radius. He is also connected with ULSS Dolomites, the local health service. The SUEM is part of this system, and helicopter rescue is funded and managed through ULSS. So doctors, dispatchers, and administrators all know Gaspari. In the hospital in Pieve di Cadore, to many staff members, he is not an anonymous technician, but a colleague with whom they have worked in the same chain for decades. At 64, when many have long since retired, he continues to work in several directions at once: guide, rescuer, historian, advisor, writer. He never has a free month. Every summer season, ascents; every winter, training courses, meetings, archival work. And not one of these roles gives way to the others. One of these roles is free climbing, with friends, without clients, without archives, without meetings. The 17th of September, 2025, becomes a day for precisely that. The morning in Ronde di Cadore, at the foot of the Cima Grande di Lavaredo, is calm and clear. The temperature is around 0, the air dry. September in the Dolomites is considered the best month for classic routes. Cold rock gives reliable friction, the holds are dry, and there are noticeably fewer tourists on the walls than in July or August. Gaspari drives up to the Rifugio Aronzo, a large mountain hut, standing directly beneath the south face of the Cima. This is the classic starting point for ascents on all 3 towers. With him are 2 companions. These are not clients. These are friends and rope partners with whom he has climbed for many years. The outing is planned as an ordinary private day in the mountains. No targets, no records. The plan is simple. Climb the Via Normale on Cima Grande. This is the most classic route on the central tower of the Cima, first climbed on the 21st of August, 1869, by Paul Groman, roped with the guides Franz Innerkofler and Peter Salcher. Since then, the route has hardly changed. It remains the main path to this summit for people who master classic Dolomite climbing technique. The technical data looks like this. Grade 4 minus on the UIAA scale, about 450 to 500 meters of climbing on the southeast face. Several key sections. A slab section at the start, then an inside corner, then a characteristic chimney, after which the route leads onto a circular ledge in the upper part of the tower. For a guide of Gaspari's level, this is familiar work. He has climbed Cima Grande Via Normale dozens of times over his career, with clients and without them, and knows the wall literally by heart. The 3 of them head toward the route in the morning, while the sun has only just touched the upper ridge. The air on the wall is almost still. Below, on the plateau, the first groups of tourists are beginning to move toward the Rifugio Locatelli. The The rope team enters the wall. The Via Normale on Cima Grande runs along the southeast side of the tower and is built from several distinct sections, well known to anyone who has been here. The first pitches are grade 2, climbing, comfortable, and unhurried. Big holds on gray-yellow dolomite, slabs with good friction, short steps between ledges. On this section, the leader moves quickly, placing protection in familiar spots. Higher up begins the key part of the route, the inside chimney. This is a narrow vertical slot in the rock, into which the climber enters entirely, bracing his body between the walls. The work is done with the back and knees. The hands are used not for pulling up, but for holding position. The technique requires practice. For those who have climbed chimneys many times, this is more slow mechanics than a powerful move. Franco knows this chimney to perfection. Above the chimney, the wall eases. The climbing shifts into more varied terrain. Small overhangs, wide ledges, short grade 3 walls. The route brings the team out onto a circular ledge, a horizontal band wrapping around the upper part of the tower. This is one of the most recognizable places on the entire Via Normale. From here, the view opens onto the Auronzo Valley and onto the neighboring Cima Ovest and Cima Piccola. From the circular ledge to the summit, only a little remains. A few dozen meters along a ridge section. Easy even, but exposed climbing. Here you need attention to the wind and to the small stones lying unstable on the ledges. Gaspari leads. This has been his habitual position since his youth. The capocordata, the leader of the rope team, setting the rope and placing the protection. The group moves calmly, without hurry. Below, on the meadow plateau, you can see strings of tourists walking toward the Refugio Locatelli and the gray rectangles of tents near the road. The three of them emerge from the chimney onto the ledge. Only a few minutes of climbing remain to the cairn on the summit. Those few minutes to the summit become the point at which everything changes. At some moment, already on the ridge section, Franco Gaspari falls. His companions are below and a little to the side. The terrain on this part of the route is not straight. Rocky outcrops and short towers of the ridge block the view between team members. They do not see the moment of the fall. The site of the fall is behind a spire, which hides it from their position. They do not hear a sound either. The ridge is built so that the fall goes not downward, to the south, where they had come from, but to the north, toward the opposite couloir of the tower. The north face of Cima Grande drops off vertically, and a sound going down from the ledge to the north does not return to the southern climbers. Seconds pass. The rope team notices something at the level of sensation, not hearing. The tension of the rope changes. It is pulling in an unexpected direction. Its weight has become different. A moment later, the picture is already clear. The capocordata does not answer. He is neither seen nor heard. The rope hangs in an unfamiliar geometry. According to accounts in the Italian press, Il Gazzettino, La Voce del Nord-Est, Corriere delle Alpi, one of the main versions being considered is linked to a sudden medical episode. In Italian, this is called malore, a vague term denoting a sharp indisposition, loss of consciousness, or an acute cardiac event. For a guide of his experience moving along a familiar route in good conditions, such an explanation looks most likely. What exactly happened on the ledge, no one can say for sure. There are no witnesses to the fall itself. The picture can only be reconstructed later, from the results of the subsequent work of investigators and doctors. But for the next few minutes, something else matters. Help must be called. Help must be called. And help comes from the very system in which Gaspari himself worked for 40 years. At around 10:50, one of the partners contacts the emergency service 118. This is the Italian equivalent of the Unified Medical Line. The dispatcher passes the call upward to the regional structure SUEM Veneto, responsible for mountain rescue in the Dolomites. The standard chain is set in motion. At the airbase in Pieve di Cadore, a rescue helicopter prepares for takeoff. Falco or Leone, those very machines Gaspari had flown in since the 80s, first as a young technician, then as an experienced rescuer. On board, a crew of pilot, doctor, and rescue technician. All of them belong to the Suem Veneto community. Many know Gaspari personally. The helicopter heads toward the Tre Cime. The flight from Pieve to Auronzo takes minutes. Approaching the tower, the crew sees the familiar panorama, 3 vertical walls casting shadows across the morning plateau. The coordinates of the call bring them to the north side of Cima Grande, to where Franco is. The operation runs according to the standard scheme. The pilot holds the machine in a hover above the wall, wrestling with air currents that behave unpredictably near such sheer massifs. The rescue technician descends on the cable to the spot where Franco is. He assesses the situation, secures him in the rescue harness, sends the signal up. For the people on board, this is not an abstract operation. They are lifting a man with whom many of them had worked in a rope team, with whom they had flown over these same walls, from whom they had learned the very things they are doing now. 40 years ago, Gaspari himself descended the same kind of cable to fallen climbers. Today, he is on the other end of that rope. The helicopter descends, on board, the technician, the doctor, and Franco. Course for the nearest landing zone, where the ground team is waiting. At the landing zone, the ground team is waiting, a doctor and a CNSAS coordinator. Franco Gaspari is received, examined. The conclusion leaves no doubt. Help is no longer possible. The doctor fixes the time, fills out the documents. Word goes out along several lines at the same time. To CNSAS, Veneto headquarters, an official notification of the death of a member. To the Cortina commune, through familiar administrators and council members. To guide Alpine Cortina, through the internal channels of the college. To the family, by the path by which such news is always passed in mountain valleys, through the closest people, in person. By midday the news breaks in the Italian media. Il Gazzettino Belluno, Corriere delle Alpi, Il Dolomiti, TV, iWeb, Montagna.tv. Then, ANSA picks it up, the main Italian news agency, and from there the material spreads through the regional outlets of Veneto, Trentino, and Lombardy. The first publications, according to Italian journalistic norms, do not name him. In the headlines, Tragedia sulle tre cime, 64-year-old falls from Cima Grande, mountain guide loses his life. They mention the age, Cortina d'Ampezzo, Soccorso Alpino. For most readers in Italy at that moment, this is still an abstract mountain tragedy, one of hundreds per season. But in the Ampezzo Valley, the picture is different. It is enough to know the age and the membership in the Scoiattoli to understand who is meant. By midday in Cortina, his name is already being spoken. It spreads faster than the official messages come out. For clients, colleagues, neighbors, and historians, it is a blow on several levels at once. The elders of the Scoiattoli gather that same day at the group's clubhouse. They are losing one of the oldest members, a man who had worn the red sweater with the squirrel for decades. At Guide Alpine Cortina, the first public announcement is being prepared. By evening it appears on the college website, and it is from this statement that a wave begins which will run for several days through the Italian mountain media. This wave runs in several directions at once. Soccorso Alpino Veneto publishes a short, restrained statement. It speaks of the death of one of the oldest and most respected members of the service, of 40 years of experience, of his contribution to the development of helicopter rescue in the Dolomites. The tone of such statements from Italian rescuers is always the same, professional, without pathos, with respect for the family. ULSS Dolomiti, to which the SUEM is organizationally tied, issues its own message. It sounds different, more emotional. The leadership of ULSS calls Gaspari a shining example, competent and courageous, and adds, "We will not forget him." This formulation makes it into the headlines of Il Dolomiti and spreads through the regional media. That same evening, Guide Alpine Cortina takes down its website, leaving only a single black band of mourning with Gaspari's name on it. The college does not add long texts. In a profession where silence is always valued more than words, that is enough. Planet Mountain, one of the leading Italian climbing portals, publishes a full obituary. The headline reads, "Farewell, Franco Gaspari, great guide, rescuer, and the historical memory of Cortina." The text lists his roles: member of the Scoiattoli, former president of the Guides College, one of the first SUEM helicopter technicians, author of the book on the Daimai family. That same day, the piece runs through all the major mountain portals in Italy. On social networks, a different wave begins, a personal one. Clients who had climbed with Gaspari post short notes with their memories. Fellow rescuers share photographs from joint operations. Climbers tag him in posts from routes he had led. These texts repeat the same words, almost regardless of the author: calm, reliable, knew every stone. Many also formulate the paradox: a man who had pulled thousands of others off the walls could not be pulled off himself. It is precisely this symmetry, a rescuer killed on a familiar wall, that makes Gaspari's story a subject which will live for several more days on the front pages of the Italian press. Behind that story, the front page, the paradox, the wave of condolences, stands another, quieter one. The story of a man who at 64 was choosing, summer after summer, whether to go up on the mountain or stay below, and who answered that question with every new year. At that age, Gaspari was no longer the active guide he had been at 30 or 40. The body, even the most well-trained, works differently. Reactions are a little slower. Strength on long climbs runs out sooner. But he was still in the shape required for the Dolomite Classics. Multi-day expeditions and technical grade 6 walls had long since given way to more even, familiar routes. He continued to lead clients, and he continued to climb with friends, for himself. Cima Grande Via Normale was, for him, a form of return. He had first climbed this route back in the early 80s, long before joining the Soccorso Alpino. Over 40 years, he had been up it dozens of times. Every stone, every anchor point, every feature of the chimney he remembered in detail. For many guides, such climbs cease to be work and become a personal ritual. In Italian professional circles, a discussion has long been underway. To what age should a guide remain on the wall? It is an uncomfortable question. Physical capacity declines, but along with it grows experience and instinct. There are no formal limits. Many Italian guides keep working at 65 and at 70. Gaspari was one of those who answered this question not with words, but with practice. As long as health allows, as long as the rope team trusts you, as long as you have the strength for the classics. His last climb fit precisely into this logic, with 2 close friends, without clients, without a commercial outing. This is what the mountain had been for him since his youth, not work and not sport, but a form of existence. The story of Franco Gaspari ends a few dozen meters below the summit of Cima Grande. On that same ledge, he himself had crossed dozens of times, helping others reach the cairn. That ledge is now inscribed in a biography that goes on, living even after the tragedy itself. In the days after his death, Italian newspapers published detailed pieces on Gaspari's career. Corriere delle Alpi runs an extended article under the headline Cortina sconvolta dalla morte di Franco Gaspari. Chi era lo scoiattolo morto sulle tre cime? Il Dolomiti, TV e Web, News in Quota offer their own versions. Photographs from the archives, quotes from colleagues, a list of the main milestones. The book Antonio Di Maideo, Una famiglia di guide alpine, which Gaspari wrote together with Carlo Gandini, returns to the shelves of Cortina's mountain bookshops. At the Scoiattoli Publishing House, the possibility of a reissue is being discussed. For readers who had never heard the name before, the book becomes a point of entry. Through it, they learn both about the Daimai family and about the author himself. Fellow Scoiattoli speak in interviews about the same thing, about the memory of the valley which went with him. Gaspari was a bearer of the oral history of Cortina's guides. He knew in which year a particular guide had opened a particular route, who had been roped with whom in the 30s, on which walls men from Ampezzo had died in the First World War. This knowledge is nowhere fully written down. It cannot be learned, only received from a person. In technical discussions of safety on the Tres Cimes, his case is cited as an example of another subject. Even a perfectly familiar route, even a highly experienced guide, even calm conditions do not rule out sudden events. This is not a conclusion. This is a reminder. On the website of the Cortina Guides College, his page remains where it was, without updates, with a photograph and a short biography. The story of Franco Gaspari becomes part of a long list of Ampezzo guides who died on the very walls they had watched over their whole lives. For Cortina, his passing is not simply the loss of one man. It is a break in a chain of memory that he himself had spent his life so carefully assembling. Yalung Ri Sunday morning, the 7th of September, 2025. The Mont Blanc Massif, the Italian side of the Brenva face, an altitude of roughly 3,500 meters. 61-year-old Jean-Michel Beacco, a well-known French professor of finance, director of the Institut Louis Bachelier, is rappelling on the classic route up the Tour Ronde. Above him, at the anchor station, his own son is belaying. A few seconds later, the anchor holding the whole system gives way, and the father plunges down the couloir, more than 150 meters, right before his son's eyes. What exactly failed at that one point? And why does a single small piece of gear decide everything, even on a mountain where thousands of rope teams pass every season? Jean-Michel Beacco lived two lives, and both were real. The first began in Aix-en-Provence, where he was born, and moved on to Paris, where he went to study and work. In that first life, he was an engineer and a high-level financier, a graduate of the École des Ponts et Chaussées, a visiting scholar at Berkeley, a doctoral student in Munich, a holder of an executive MBA from Stanford. In that life, he moved easily between London, New York, and Tokyo, worked at Société Générale, then at Crédit Agricole, then at Natixis, traded bonds, managed long positions, read the markets the way other people read train schedules. His second life began where the office ended. From 2009 onward, for more than 16 years, he ran the Institut Louis Bachelier, one of the key financial research centers in France. From 2010, he was an associate professor at Université Paris-Dauphine. Since 1995, he had been teaching courses at Sciences Po. He was chair of the Department of Economics, Management and Finance at the same École des Ponts Paris Tech, from which he himself had once graduated. To his students, he was a big, warm professor who knew how to make complicated things clear. But his life had a third layer, invisible to most of his colleagues. He was a climber, not the kind who goes to the Alps once a year for a photo, but the kind who has been walking in the mountains for decades. He skied, he snowboarded. He knew the rhythms of the Mont Blanc Massif as well as his own lecture timetables. His office smelled of books and coffee, while his backpack was home to crampons and an ice axe. He didn't work as a guide, and he didn't chase records. He practiced what in Europe is called club alpinism, independent outings, personal responsibility, no commerce. By the time he reached 60, this was his way of life. This third life of Beacco's was not a solitary one. He had 4 children, and from an early age one of his sons had been going into the mountains with him. The father didn't send the boy on a commercial expedition with a guide and didn't leave him in the care of instructors at some climbing camp. Everything a beginner needed to know, the son received directly from him. How to strap on crampons so they didn't shift. How to hold an ice axe on a steep slope. How to build a belay station. How to handle the rope. How to tie knots. How to belay a partner from below and from above. This was not a weekend program. It was a long, slow apprenticeship, stretched over years. The father would show, the son would repeat. Each season was a little harder than the last. They went into the Alps first on easy routes, then on more serious ones, then on the real classic lines. For the son, the mountains did not become a separate athletic hobby, but part of being with his father. Where other families had fishing or cycling, they had crampons, ropes, and an altimeter. By the day of the events we are about to describe, the son was a fully grown rope partner, not a child being dragged up a mountain for experience, not a client paying for an ascent. He was an equal partner, capable of doing his share of the work. They already went out as 2 adult climbers, divided tasks, shared responsibility, mutual trust. And yet, in any father and son rope team, there is something that does not disappear with age. One remains the leader, the other the follower. One decides whether to go for the route today. The other agrees because it's his father. That's a normal, healthy structure, until the mountain starts testing it for strength. The Tour Ronde was preparing precisely such a test for them. The mountain sits on the border between France and Italy, in the very heart of the Mont Blanc Massif, and its summit rises to 3,792 meters. By alpine standards it is no giant, but it is not a stroll either. The Tour Ronde is one of the most popular objectives in the Massif precisely for those who go without a guide. It is considered a classic for climbers at Beacco's level, experienced but not professional mountaineers who come to Chamonix or Courmayeur with their own gear and their own rope team. The classic route to the summit goes up the eastern side, from the Torino hut standing on the Italian slope. In alpine grading, the route is rated PD or PD+, slightly difficult on the French scale. Technically, it really is not a great challenge. No vertical walls, no ultra-steep ice sections, no exotic maneuvers. But that is deceptive. The route demands crampons, an ice axe, confident rope work, the ability to move roped up across a crevassed glacier. On the way, there's a bergschrund, the gap between the glacier and the rock base of the mountain, which you cross by a snow bridge or by climbing over. Beyond that, a steep snow slope, rocky outcrops leading to the ridge, a short but serious section just below the summit. In the climbing community, the Tour Ronde is described with two words at once: a school mountain and deceptively accessible. A school mountain because generations of French and Italian climbers have learned to move on it. Deceptively accessible because every season it racks up its own statistics of falls, frostbite, emergency descents, and rescue operations. The mountain punishes precisely for underestimation. It doesn't look frightening in photographs, and that is its main trap. A person comes here as if on a classic outing and forgets that he is above 3,500 meters, where mistakes are not forgiven. On that morning, the mountain didn't look like a trap. A Sunday, the 7th of September, 2025. The season of classic routes in the Massif was already winding down. The nights were getting longer, the upper snows were freezing hard in the mornings. Commercial expeditions were wrapping up. But the weather that weekend still allowed for classic climbs. Jean-Michel and his son set out for the Tour Ronde along the normal route from the Italian Torino hut. Exactly the line that club rope teams have been climbing for decades. They moved rope together. They wore helmets, crampons, and harnesses, and carried ice axes. In their packs, a rope, spare slings, carabiners, extra clothing, water, and food. Everything, in short, that counts as the mandatory kit for a PD route in the Massif. The climb took several hours. First the glacier, then the bergschrund. That same gap you have to cross carefully and without mistakes. Then a snow slope whose angle you feel in your calves. Then rocky outcrops onto the ridge and a short final section to the summit. At 3,792 meters, everything people come to this Massif for opens up at their feet. To the west rises Mont Blanc itself, blindingly white in the morning light. To the south, the Italian Brenva slopes, the famous ice arena where the best climbers of Europe go every season. To the north and east, the scaly ridges of the Massif, peaks and needles whose names are known to anyone who has ever planned a route in Chamonix. Father and son reached the summit. That was the stated goal of the day. In photographs of such rope teams, these moments always look the same. A family triumph, two people at the top, side by side, a single frame that holds several years of shared preparation. But the summit of the Tour Ronde, like any other summit in the Massif, is not the end of the climb, only half of it. The statistics of alpine accidents are harsh and simple. On classic routes, most tragedies happen on the descent. Fatigue sets in. The sun climbs higher, the snow begins to melt, becomes soft and unreliable. Attention slips. It feels as though the main part is done, that all that's left is to get back. Rope teams relax, and that is precisely when most accidents happen. Beacco and his son made the decision that is standard on the Tour Ronde. They chose to descend not back down the eastern side, but down the Italian one, onto the Brenva face. It's a common variation, called a traverse. You cross the mountain all the way through, climbing up one side and descending the other. For many climbers, it is part of the ritual, to visit both faces of the mountain, to see it whole. The father and son team took exactly that route, but the Brenva option has its price. It is precisely on this side that you meet sections you cannot walk down on foot. Rocky walls, drops, short but steep steps. These are descended on a rope, by rappelling. For Jean-Michel and his son, this technique was nothing new. They had done it many times, in different mountains, in different conditions. The father had taught the son to rappel when he was still a teenager, and by that day rope work was routine for both of them. And yet, in any series of rappels, there is a property that experienced climbers know about, and that beginners discover at the worst possible moment. On a rappel, the climber depends entirely on a single point, on one anchor, on one station. Everything else, the rope, the gear, the technique, plugs in only through it. As long as the station holds, the system works. If the station goes, nothing else works. Around 10 in the morning, the rope team reached such a section. It was a rocky step in the upper part of the Brenva, which you cannot descend on foot. You need a rope, you need a station, you need a rappel. Jean-Michel took the setup on himself. He assessed the terrain, chose the point, rigged the spare sling material, checked the tension. The sun stayed above, on a self-belay, connected to the station by a short tether. His job at that moment was to watch the rope, to keep an eye on the station, to wait while his father descended. It's a standard scheme, familiar to anyone who has climbed as a rope team. The more experienced goes down first. He checks the line of descent, assesses whether there's enough rope, looks for a place to stand or to build the next station. When the first person is safe, the second follows. A logical division of roles, tested many times on real routes. Beneath their feet, a steep rock and snow couloir. It dropped sharply down the Italian side, framed by rock outcrops. The altitude at that spot was several hundred meters below the summit, in the upper part of the Brenva face. Lower down, snowfields began, then the glacier, then moraines and trails where tourists walk up to the Torino. But from there, from the station on the Brenva, all of that structure looked distant and small, the whole space compressed to a single point, to the anchor. In moments like that, the climber stops thinking about the view, the weather, the time. All his attention is concentrated on one thing: what is holding the system? On the sling threaded through a flake or clipped to a point in the rock. On the station that must accept the weight of a human being and let him descend. The father stepped back to the edge, shifted his weight onto the rope, and began the descent. The sun was above at the station. Between them, a few meters of rope, one belay point, and a familiar, carefully rehearsed sequence of movements. And that is where the familiar sequence broke. According to the preliminary findings of the Italian mountain gendarmerie, it was precisely the anchor, the point holding the whole station, that suddenly gave way. What exactly failed? An old bolt, someone else's sling, a rock flake, a loop, is not specified in open sources. The Italian gendarmerie has stated the main point. The cause of the fall was the failure of the belay point. That is a very precise technical description of a very short moment. In climbing, there is almost never a pause between everything is fine and everything is over. The station either holds or it doesn't. The rope either works or it doesn't. In one instant, the system supporting Jean-Michel stopped holding his weight. The link to the couloir disappeared. The point that a second earlier had been reliable no longer existed. Jean-Michel went down the line of the slope without control. The rope, which a second earlier had been his support, now fell with him. Neither the ice axe, nor the crampons, nor the terrain of the couloir offered a point he could catch on to. From that moment on, the trajectory was decided by the mountain itself. The sun remained above, at the station, a few meters away. He was clipped in by a self-belay to the remaining part of the system. Between him and what was happening to his father, there was neither rope nor a distance at which he could intervene. It was one of those situations in which a rope partner objectively can do nothing. The belay system between them no longer worked. According to the Italian rescuers, Jean-Michel fell more than 150 meters down the steep couloir on the Brenva side. English-language media later rounded the figure to 500 feet, which is where the Snowbrains and Teton Gravity research headlines about a 500-foot fall come from. But the point is not in the units of measurement. 150 meters down, a steep couloir on a high alpine face is a distance on which a controlled stop is technically impossible. The couloir dropped sharply down the Italian side of the massif. Its walls were pressed in by rock. Its bed was a mix of snow, ice, pieces of broken stone, and patches of bedrock. The rope, the slings, the ice axe in his hand, all of that is designed for a working belay system, not for movement down a slope without one. The trajectory ended far below, in a zone that neither a hand nor a voice from the station could reach. The sun remained at the same point where he had been standing a minute earlier, on a rocky step, clipped in by a self-belay to what was left of the station, at an altitude of about 3,500 meters. Around him, everything was the same rocks, the same snow, the same views. But a familiar classic route had, in 1 second, turned into an accident marker on the map of the massif. In the mountains, people often talk about the silence that follows major events, the silence after an avalanche, the silence after a rockfall, the silence after a fall. That silence is not empty. The rustle of snow, the click of carabiners, the whistle of the wind between the rocks still live inside it. But the whole acoustic space now works differently. It underscores one simple fact. A rope team that a minute ago was working as a single whole has been torn apart, and the sun, standing at the anchor, was left on one of the most classic mountains of the Mont Blanc Massif on the morning of an ordinary Sunday. He himself was uninjured. He had been on a self-belay and was above the point of failure. The rope had gone down without pulling him with it. Physically, he was standing exactly where he had stood a second earlier, the same helmet, the same harness, the same crampons on his feet. But the state he was in was no longer a working one. In mountain rescue terminology, the condition of such people is described by one short, almost dry word: shock. There is nothing metaphorical in that word. Shock at altitude is a specific condition in which a person ceases to be fully functional. He can move, he can speak, he can carry out simple actions, but make complex decisions, work quickly with a rope, search for an alternative way down, no longer. In climbing, it is put even more simply. Such a person cannot continue the route alone. That is exactly the state the son was in. He could not descend to his father. 150 meters down the couloir, without a rope and without a station, was closed to him. He could not continue the traverse down the Brenva alone. There was no partner, no second belayer, no one to take him at the next station. He could not fix anything, undo anything, bring anything back. What he could do was call for help, reach the rescuers, give the coordinates, describe what had happened. In 2025, in the Mont Blanc Massif, communication at that altitude is no longer a luxury. Mobile networks cover most of the Italian side, and rope teams almost always have a working phone. The son made that call. From that minute on, he stopped being a participant in the climb and became a person who waits. Waits at the station, alone, above the couloir. In the official reports, that time is measured in hours. While he waited up there, down below, a mechanism long perfected in the Massif began to run. The call was received by the Italian Mountain Gendarmerie, the Soccorso Alpino Guardia di Finanza, working on the Italian side of the Mont Blanc Massif. It is one of the most experienced mountain services in Europe, used to working at altitude, on walls, in glacier crevasses, and in couloirs, just like the one where this tragedy took place. The approach to the upper part of the Brenva took several hours. According to the press, the timeline was roughly that, although exact figures are not made public, and that interval of several hours is not a delay, but an objective reality of working in the high mountains. You have to move the equipment up, assess the terrain, approach the scene, make sure the rescuers themselves are safe, and only then work on the slope. On the Tour Ronde and the Brenva, all of this is complicated by altitude, by the steepness of the slopes, and by the fact that any careless movement of the rescue party can itself become the cause of a new accident. The sequence of actions of the gendarmerie was standard and, for cases like this, well rehearsed. First, the rescuers reached the lower part of the couloir, where Jean-Michel had come to rest. Confirming death and its cause is the job of the forensic medical service, which takes over once the body is down. Then the rescuers climbed up to the station where the son was waiting. They assessed his condition, took him off his self-belay, belayed him on the descent, and escorted him down by a safe route. Recovering the body from the couloir was handled by a separate team, using a helicopter if the weather allowed, or ground-based means if it didn't. The whole operation unfolded in the standard sequence for such cases: call, approach, confirmation, evacuation, descent. But the word standard applies only to the procedure. For the son, descending with the rescuers, those were the first hours after being left alone at the station. After the work on the slope was finished, Jean-Michel's body was brought down to Courmayeur, the nearest Italian town at the foot of the Massif, the historical transit point for everyone who climbs Mont Blanc from the south. That is also where the Italian medical and judicial services sit, the ones who handle every case that happens on their side of the Massif. In Courmayeur, a forensic examiner filed the paperwork on the death in the couloir. For the Italian authorities, that document is the basis for closing the local part of the procedure. For the French side, it is the beginning of a different one, the repatriation of the body to France. Such cases in the Alps are not rare. The Mont Blanc Massif straddles the border. Rope teams from Chamonix regularly climb on the Italian side, and the repatriation of bodies via Courmayeur is as well oiled as the rescue operations themselves. In parallel, the news went out to the press. The first reports of the tragedy appeared in French media the evening of September 7th, and on Monday, the 8th. Le Dauphiné Libéré, a regional outlet, was the first to publish a short summary on its Facebook group. A French climber had died on the Italian side of the Tour Ronde. His son had witnessed the fall. France Bleu, Radio Mont Blanc, and Chamonix.net picked up the story over the next few hours. The English-language specialist media, Snowbrains, Teton Gravity Research, Skin Nordique, followed with articles the following week. The wording in all the headlines turned out to be almost the same, in different languages but with the same structure. A climber, the Tour Ronde, more than 150 meters in front of his son. Those four elements kept coming together into a headline that repeated from outlet to outlet. And it is precisely their combination that turned the story from a simple summary of a rescue operation into a narrative that got written about for days. A day after those headlines, the news reached another world, the one where Jean-Michel Beacco was not known as a climber. For the French financial and academic community, his death was a personal loss. In that world, he was not a man on a rope, but a leader, a colleague, a lecturer. One of the first with an official obituary was the École des Ponts Tech. In its statement, the school marked the passing of the president of the Department of Economics, Management, and Finance, the very department Beacco had led for several years. The Institut Louis Bachelier published its own text. The institute was saying goodbye to its longtime director, the man who for over 16 years had set its direction. In the brief wording of both texts, there is one common thread. They spoke of Beacco as someone who built institutions, not someone who built a career. A separate wave of responses came from social media. The physicist Etienne Klein wrote a post about a big, incredibly warm professor who had died on the descent from the Tour Ronde. He noted that Beacco was a rare figure in his field, generous, open, able to hold a conversation with colleagues from entirely different disciplines. Similar posts appeared on the accounts of economists, mathematicians, and lecturers at Dauphine and Sciences Po. A little later, an official memorial ceremony was announced. It was set for January 19th, 2026, and held at the Collège de France, one of the most symbolic places in French academic life. At the gathering, colleagues spoke of a man who could hold mathematics, finance, economics, and public debate together in one mind. For many of those in attendance, Jean-Michel remained a lecturer, a director, an organizer. About his second life, the crampons, the ice axes, the rope teams, and the Italian slopes of the Brenva, far from everyone knew. And it is precisely the contrast between these two worlds that makes the story of the Tour Ronde what it remains in memory. And yet, the main drama of this story is not in the contrast between the lecture hall and the mountain. It is articulated not by the academic obituaries, but by comments in climbing forums and by readers of the French press. Beneath the publications of Le Dauphiné Libéré, Chamonix.net, in specialist Facebook communities, a conversation opened up about just how much every family rope team in the mountains depends on a single point in someone else's belay system, left there long ago. This conversation does not have a simple answer, and that matters. Formally, everything about the Beacco rope team was in order. The mountain was within their abilities. The Tour Ronde technically matched the level of an experienced club alpinist. The gear was standard, familiar, well-tested. The son was not a child and not an unprepared beginner, but a grown partner who had spent years learning from his father. The route was one of the most popular in the Massif, climbed every year by thousands of rope teams, many of them family ones. The cause of the fall, according to the preliminary findings of the Italian mountain gendarmerie, was the failure of the belay point. That is, of a piece of the system that the rope team itself had not built, but had simply used on the route. Such points on classic lines are part of the shared infrastructure, other people's slings, old bolts, loops left behind by previous parties. It is not always possible to judge their condition by eye, and experienced climbers remind one another of this every season. As of the time of the media coverage, there is no official public technical analysis of the tragedy. The Italian gendarmerie mentions the failure of the belay point in brief comments, but the details, which point exactly from what year, of what type, have not been made public. The French climbing community has received the case quietly, without loud accusations and without ready answers. The story of the Tour Ronde on September 7, 2025, remains in collective memory as a case where one piece of gear decided everything, where an experienced father and his grown son went out on a routine classic route, and where, between them and the next season, a single weak link stood in someone else's long-finished system. On the 25th of August, 2025, he turned 68. 48 hours later, on the 27th of August, he was gone. Master of sport, instructor methodologist of the highest category, snow leopard of Russia, first ascensionist of Janga Tau, Alexander Rastorguev, the man who, over 40 years, climbed 200 summits and built one of the very few new mountaineering camps in modern Russia. His body remained on the Bezengi wall for 3 days. The evacuation proved dangerous even for the most seasoned crews in the country. What happened at 8 in the morning, at 5,000 meters? Why a rope team of 3 split into 3 different fates in a matter of seconds. This is the story of one of the loudest rockfall incidents of the Caucasus season of 2025. On the 25th of August, 1957, in the southern Urals, a boy was born into an ordinary Soviet family. They named him Alexander, and years later, the entire mountaineering community of the country would come to know this surname, Rastorguev, Alexander Alexeyevich, a name that, 68 years on, would stand beside the names of those who defined an entire era of Russian mountaineering. The southern Urals are not a postcard image. These are industrial cities, black snow beside metallurgical plants, sharp swings in temperature, and harsh winters that last longer than the calendar prescribes. It is a place where boys learn from childhood to handle cold and heavy loads. The mountains here are not tall by Caucasian standards, but they are real. Rocky ridges, taiga, fast rivers. A child who grows up in such a region learns early that nature has a character of its own, and that you have to treat it seriously. Little is publicly known about the early years of Rastorgev's life. His family did not give interviews, and he himself rarely spoke about his childhood in the press. What is known is the essentials. He studied, played sports, grew up strong and stubborn. Character forms in the atmosphere of factory towns, where a man's word is his bond, and no one is given a pass because of age. That habit of discipline and heavy work would later become the foundation of his mountaineering school. The first major milestone in his biography was his enrollment at the Magnitogorsk Mining and Metallurgical Institute, named after Grigory Ivanovich Nosov. It is one of the main technical schools of the Urals, a university that trained engineers for the country's heavy industry. Alexander chose an engineering track. Here he learned to work with calculations, materials, and structures. Here, too, the foundations of his technical thinking were laid, thinking that would later prove useful on a completely different scale, when he would be constructing a mountaineering camp on the slopes of the northern Caucasus. From his youth, he was drawn to nature, to altitude, to physical labor. But for a long time, all of this looked like a hobby of an engineer with a factory career ahead of him. And yet, immediately after graduation, life turned Rastorguev sharply toward the south of the country, toward the Caucasus. Moving to the Caucasus was not just a change of address, it was a change of climate, of the smell of the air, of the line of the horizon. Rastorguev found himself in Gelendzhik, a small town on the Black Sea coast of the Krasnodar region. The Ural ridges were left behind. Ahead lay the southern ranges. In Gelendzhik, he took a job at the Yuzhmorneft Geofizika Trust. It was a serious organization, engaged in marine seismic exploration and engineering surveys on the Black Sea shelf. The work was applied and expeditionary, field trips, crews, equipment, responsibility. For a young engineer, this was a solid practical school. Later, he would head a major commercial company. His career built up steadily, without dramatic jumps. But the main thing here was something else. Gelendzhik sits at the foot of the western edge of the Greater Caucasus. The mountain spurs are visible from the town. Krasnodar is a few hours away. The first serious peaks are not much further. The nearness of the mountains became a constant background of Rastorgev's life. He began traveling to mountain camps, at first simply as a tourist, then with growing seriousness. The Caucasus pulls a person in gradually, but there is no coming back. At some point it became clear that an engineering career and the mountains could not coexist in equal shares. The mountains were changing his plans and interests more powerfully than any office or business trip. It was in this period that Rastorguev made the main choice of his life. He did not abandon his work entirely, but he put mountaineering first. He came to the mountains not as a boy, but already as a grown man, with a degree, a profession, and experience in expeditions. This was not the typical path of a Soviet mountaineer, who was usually drawn in while still in school through institute clubs. Rastorguev came to it later, and immediately in earnest. He already had a frame of reference: factory discipline, engineering tasks, people management. All of it he brought to mountaineering as a ready-made working style. It was precisely this turning point in Gelendzhik that set the next 40 years of his biography. He would remain in the mountains for a long time, to the very end. He stayed in the mountains for the long haul, but his path began with the basics. Rastorguev enrolled in a mountaineering school the way everyone did back then, through training camps, alpine camps, and the classification system of difficulty grades. The Caucasus offered the perfect textbook, from simple third-grade summits to top-class wall routes, from snow and ice slopes to sheer rock walls. In his first years, he learned to work on a rope team. He mastered belaying, piton placement, choosing sites for bivouacs. He learned to read mountain terrain, where rockfall was likely, where avalanches would run, where a couloir was swept from above, and where you could work in peace. He learned to move at the pace of a group and not to pull the blanket onto himself. For an engineer, this was familiar logic: system, rules, a calculus of error. Step by step, he worked through every rank of the Soviet mountaineering classification. At a certain point, he was awarded the title of Master of Sport in Mountaineering, the highest sporting title in Russian mountaineering, confirmation that a person was climbing at the level of the strongest in the country. But Rastorguev did not stop at sporting ranks. He moved into a different role. He became an instructor methodologist of the highest category in mountaineering. That meant he was trusted not with beginners, but with training the future instructors themselves. In parallel, he mastered ski mountaineering, traveling through the mountains on special skis with skins. In that discipline, he was given the highest qualification: Senior Instructor Methodologist. On top of that, he received the title of Instructor Methodologist Second Category in Alpine Skiing. Across the country, people with that combination in the mountaineering community can be counted in dozens. Rastorguev's mountain experience was not merely sporting and episodic. It was pedagogical, methodical. He didn't just climb himself. He taught others to climb, and he helped write the very rules by which they would be taught. For the people who came into mountaineering in the 80s and 90s, Rastorguev's name began to sound like the name of someone you should seek out. The quiet and assurance of an instructor who had seen everything and could put every movement into words. The next step became what they call the main ascent of a life. The main ascent for the rest of his life, Rastorguev would call one specific route. It happened in 1989 on Janga Tau. Janga Tau is one of the highest 5,000ers of the Caucasus, 5,150 meters, a massive wall mountain in the Bezengi district of Kabardino-Balkaria. Its history already held dark pages, but for the generation of the late 80s, Janga Tau was above all a vast field for new routes. In the season of 1989, Alexander Rastorguev, together with Alexander Kolchin, set out onto the wall. Their goal was not to repeat someone else's line, but to make a first ascent. That meant a line on the face that no one had ever climbed, with no description, no fixed protection points, and no guarantee that the route would go at all. Every pitch was reconnaissance. Every piton was placed for the first time. The route they completed was graded 5B with elements of 6A. In Russian and Soviet classification, this is an extremely high bar. Routes of this difficulty are usually done by combined teams, and for a two-man rope team, this was serious work at the limit. Behind such an ascent lie months of preparation, scouting with binoculars from the opposite ridge, studying photos of the wall, and planning timing in case of bad weather. 1989 was the peak of late Soviet mountaineering. It was the time of the big wall routes, when teams were climbing peak communism, Ushpa, Khan Tengri, and storming the northern walls of the Caucasus. To enter that circle meant to enter history. Rastorguev and Kolchin completed their line on Janga Tau and became first ascensionists, people whose names are forever tied to a specific line on a specific wall. Later, After all the positions, titles, and 200 summits, Rastorguev would, in short interviews, call exactly that climb his finest. Not the highest peak, not the most famous mountain, but the line on Janga Tau that he and Kolchin were the first to take. That ascent became Rastorguev's calling card for all the decades that followed, and took its place in that rare layer of Soviet mountaineering history that has not yet been forgotten. After Janga Tau, Rastorguev did not slow down. People like him rarely turn a single strong result into a pension. They keep working. Over his career, he would complete more than 200 ascents, 200 summits, a number that stands for 4 decades of trips into the mountains, physical conditioning, injuries, recoveries, winter training camps, far-off expeditions, and dozens of hours of route debriefs in the Alpine camp. Rastorguev's total experience in mountaineering exceeded 40 years. That is a rare span even for professionals. Many strong mountaineers step away from active practice by 50. Rastorguev kept going into the mountains past 60, holding on to both technical readiness and the desire to climb. At a certain point, he received the prestigious badge of Snow Leopard of Russia. This title should not be confused with the Soviet Snow Leopard, the award for climbing the 5 7,000ers of the USSR. Peak Communism, Peak Pobeda, Peak Lenin, Peak Korzenievskaya, and Khan Tengri. The Russian badge works differently. It is awarded for a sense of 10 hard-to-reach summits of the country. The list includes Elbrus, Kazbek, Beluga, the peaks of Kamchatka, including Kluchevskaya Sopka, and other peaks scattered across the geography of Russia. The difficulty is that, for the Russian Leopard, a mountaineer has to work in different climatic zones. In the Caucasus with its glaciers and rockfall, in Kamchatka with its active volcanoes, and in Siberia with its continental cold. This is an exam not only in technique, but also in endurance and versatility. Rastorguev collected every summit required. His climbing collection included the Caucasus, the Pamirs, the Tian Shan, and Kamchatka. He approached his total step by step, without loud declarations. He climbed and closed routes one after another. By the mid-2000s, his name was known to the entire mountaineering community of southern Russia. He was seen as a man combining 3 profiles in one: athlete, instructor, and senior comrade. At some point, that reputation moved him out of the category of active competitors and into the category of those who set the rules of the game for others. That fork in the road came in 2010. Rastorguev was elected president of the Mountaineering Federation of the Krasnodar region. He served in that post for 2 years, all of 2010 and 2011. The Mountaineering Federation of the Krasnodar region is one of the most significant regional structures in Russian mountaineering. The region borders the Caucasus. Many people here go to the mountains. Clubs, sections, and schools are based here. But you need someone who can turn all this into a working system. Competitions, training camps, preparing rank climbers, working with young people. Rastorguev took on exactly that role. Under his leadership, the regional federation established itself as one of the most active in the country. He brought back into the fold people who had drifted away from the sport, and he drew in new young athletes from all across the Krasnodar region. For him, this was not an honorary title, but an active front line. At the same time as the regional work, he joined the active ranks of the All-Russian Federation of Mountaineering of Russia. He was entrusted with heading the Educational Methodological Commission of the Federation. The commission is responsible for the standards of instructor training throughout the country. That means which textbooks to use, what program to teach on the certification course, how to assess graduates, how to certify trainers. Through this commission, Rastorguev became one of the people whose decisions shaped the entire landscape of training. He did not settle into the chair of an honorary president, but into a working chair, which he left only for training camps and climbs. The transition from personal ascents to systemic work was the conscious choice of a mature athlete. After 50, mountaineers usually face a fork, either cling to their former shape or pass on their experience. Rastorguev chose the second path, but did not give up the first. He continued climbing in the mountains right up to his final season. It was in this period that his professional ties spread across the whole of the North Caucasus, including regions where mountaineering had been in decline for decades. And there, in the south, he would soon be offered the project that would become his engineering testament, The project that became his engineering testament appeared in Ingushetia. The Republic wanted to rebuild on its territory a full-fledged mountaineering center, the kind that had operated in Soviet times in the Elbrus region, Bezengi and Tse. Specialists of national stature were brought in to tackle the task. Rastorguev was appointed to the working group of the government of the Republic of Ingushetia. His title within the project sounded dry. Chief engineer of the project to build the mountaineering camp, Kayazi. Behind those words lay an enormous amount of work. A location had to be chosen, infrastructure calculated, buildings designed, approaches made safe, and logistics matched to the mountain terrain and local infrastructure. For an engineer with a mountaineering background, it was the kind of task for which a biography had been building itself for 40 years. The Kayazi camp is located in the Jayrak district of Ingushetia. This is a mountain district on the border with Georgia, with its own system of peaks and gorges. According to the plan, Kayazi would become the first full-scale mountaineering center of modern format in the northeastern Caucasus. In Soviet times, this region had no such camp. The mountaineering was happening further west. By design, the camp can host up to 2,000 mountaineers a year. Kayazi runs classes for every level of training, from a beginner's school to the highest level camps. Routes are available from the 1st to the 6th grade of difficulty. That means everything from training climbs for novices to serious wall lines for active masters of sport. Rastorguev was responsible for engineering and for the safety of the entire infrastructure. Technical decisions passed through him, and so did the safety protocols. His signature stands on dozens of documents that determine whether the camp can receive people without risk. Through this project, he effectively brought mountaineering back to a region from which it had been disappearing for decades. In the early 20s, Kayazi opened its doors and quickly reached its planned capacity. For Ingushetia, this was a new point on the map of Russian sport. For Rastorguev, it was the practical continuation of what he had been doing his whole life in the Caucasus, only in the form of stone, concrete, and working drawings. Stone, concrete, and blueprints were only one side of his work. The other was the people who had to be trained for the mountains. Alongside this Kayazi construction, Rastorguev took on another load. He became the official in charge of safety at the Central Instructors School of the Federation of Mountaineering of Russia. The Central Instructors School is the country's main forge of cadres. Future instructors pass through it, who then go on to hundreds of camps and clubs, from St. Petersburg to Primoria. To be responsible for safety here means ensuring that students are not injured during training, that exercises on rock and ice follow strict standards, and that every training climb ends with everyone coming back. In parallel, he worked at the Federation's training camps for the Mountain Rescue Badge. This is a separate program, after which a mountaineer gains the right to take part in rescue operations. The country's main forge of qualified rescuers operates precisely through such camps. Rastorguev here was one of the top-tier trainers. Later, he was invited into yet another structure. He was appointed senior trainer of the training camps for the internal troops of the Ministry of Internal Affairs of Russia and the Federation of Mountaineering of Russia. There he trained specialists in mountaineering and mountain skiing preparation for the security services. His students were people who would later have to work at altitude on real-world tasks. For many active instructors in the country, Rastorguev became a mentor. Hundreds of students and young climbers passed through his hands. His teaching style was recognizable, a hard school of safety, drilling standard actions to the point of reflex, a refusal to tolerate sloppiness. He worked from a simple principle. In the mountains, you cannot learn from your mistakes because the price of a mistake can be too high. By 2025, Alexander Rastorguev was one of the project leads for Kayazi and a key figure in the methodological work of the entire country. Behind him lay 200 ascents, dozens of opened routes, a school of instructors, the construction in Ingushetia, and 40 years of mountain experience. And precisely at that moment, the last season of his life began. By the summer of 2025, the last season of his life looked, to those around him, completely ordinary. Rastorguev was 67. In a few days, on the 25th of August, he would turn 68. At that age, most climbers at his level have long since moved on to meetings and route debriefs at the Alpine camp. Rastorguev was still personally going into the mountains. The place he chose was familiar, Bezengi, This is the central district of the main Caucasian Range, the area on which the whole face of Russian high-altitude mountaineering depends. The region is known as the Little Himalayas. The name was not invented by chance. The concentration of 5,000ers here is greater than anywhere else in the Caucasus. Here too stands the famous Bezengi Wall, a 13-kilometer massif, above which several summits higher than 5,000 meters rise at once. In August, Rastorguev came to the training camp at the Bezengi Alpine Camp. The camp stands in the gorge of the Cherek-Bezengiski River, on the approaches to the glacier and the wall. Every classic route in the district starts here. Rastorguev knew every place here. He had been in this camp many times, personally taken part in the construction of instructors' schools, and worked at the Federation's training events. The objective of this camp was Janga Tau, one of the most technically demanding 5,000ers of the Caucasus. The Janga Tau Massif is complex in its structure. It consists of 3 separate summits, the main one, 5,085 meters, the western one, 5,058, the eastern one, 5,033. All 3 belong to that very 13-kilometer Bezengi Wall. Glaciers descend from them, rockfalls regularly sweep down the couloirs, and the weather can change in hours. The routes on Janga Tau start at 4B and go up. That is a serious level, but well within the working range for a master of sport. For Rastorguev, such a climb was familiar work, the kind he had done dozens of times in other districts. On the 25th of August, a Monday, exactly on the day of his 68th birthday, a party of 3 left the camp to make the ascent. For Rastorguev, this would be the final start. For that final start, Rastorguev did not go alone. Alexander Alexeyevich himself and 2 younger athletes. One of the participants was Ekaterina Fyodorova. The name of the 3rd participant has not been publicly disclosed in the media. He appears in the emergency services report simply as a companion of the group. In that rope team, Rastorguev was the senior and the most experienced. The gap in experience between him and the others was obvious. Behind him lay 200 summits and 40 years in the mountains, while the younger participants had objectively less. But the distribution of roles in such a group is standard. The senior leads, the juniors work on the rope. Each carries their share of the common load. He knew the Bezengi Massif well. He had been there many times. He had personally taken part in the work of instructors' schools, had passed through training camps, climbed a variety of routes, knew the approaches to the wall, knew the character of the glacier. For him, this was not a new mountain, but a home district, where nearly every classic line had been climbed and described. The group moved according to the standard plan: approach across the glacier, work up the steps, and then out onto rock terrain. The route was designed for several days of work on the wall. It was not a 2-day push, but a full-scale ascent requiring bivouacs and intermediate camps. By August standards, the weather and the condition of the terrain were assessed as workable. Summer in Bezengi is the peak of the season. The sky is usually clear in the morning, the winds moderate, visibility stretches the whole length of the wall. The risks, too, are well known. By midday, intensive thawing of the rock begins, and rockfall danger rises sharply. The classic tactic is to cross dangerous sections in the early morning before the sun heats the wall. On the 26th of August, the group continued the ascent. Rastorguev and his partners moved at a classic pace. Camp, approach, work on the wall, next camp. Nothing that stood out from the usual routine of a strong climb in the Caucasus. No warning signs. And then, everything changed in a matter of seconds. On the 27th of August, the group continued moving along the route on Janga Tau. They were working in the zone through which every classic line of the district passes. Up to that moment, the ascent was proceeding normally. During the climb, a massive rockfall came down from the sections above. Rockfalls on the Bezengi Wall are a known and constant risk at the end of summer. The mechanism is well understood. In August, the wall is thawing actively. Warm air and direct sunlight melt the ice that has held rock blocks in place for years. When the icy bond weakens, the blocks break loose and come down. The rocks travel along the couloirs at great speed. Their trajectories are unpredictable. One stone can hit a rocky ledge and change direction. The sound of a rockfall on Bezengi is familiar to anyone who has worked here. A short whistle, then a heavy roar, and there is little time to react. Rastorguev's group found themselves in the path of the rockfall. On a wall like that, a a rope team has almost no room to maneuver. They were going where the line of the route required, and at that moment, the line was being raked from above. According to the official information of the Federation of Mountaineering of Russia and the Emergency Services reports, Alexander Rastorguev sustained severe injuries and died on the spot. Helping him in those conditions was already impossible. A vertical wall at more than 5,000 meters, with no medical assistance available. Ekaterina Fyodorova was injured and remained on the slope, unable to move on her own. The third member of the group was unharmed. By chance, he ended up outside the direct line of the falling rocks. In such situations, it is often precisely the geometry of the terrain that decides who is luckier and who is not. A rope team that had been moving up the route at a working pace that morning turned in a few seconds into a full-blown emergency. Over the next few hours, word of the incident reached the Bezengi Alpine camp. From that moment, the clock began ticking on the rescue operation. The rescue operation began with the hardest step. The third member of the group, the one who was unharmed, had to make his own way down to the Bezengi camp. Communications in that district do not work everywhere, and the only reliable way to pass on the distress call was to walk down to the camp in person. Descending alone through rockfall terrain requires absolute focus. You must not only make your own way down, you must do it after watching the senior of your group die in front of you and leaving your second partner injured on the wall. You must mark the dangerous sections, change your pace, control your emotions. Any mistake on the descent can turn into another disaster. The third participant reached the Alpine camp. At the camp, the rescue operation procedure was set in motion at once. It is a standard protocol, refined over decades. A message to the dispatcher, coordinates, a description of the group's condition, a request for a helicopter. The information was promptly passed on to the Elbrus High Altitude Search and Rescue Unit of the Emergency Ministry. This is a specialized division of the Ministry for Emergency Situations, working in the Central Caucasus. Its personnel are trained specifically for high-altitude work. Into the zone came a commercial helicopter of the company Heli Action. It is one of the few machines capable of operating reliably at such altitudes in the Caucasus. Ordinary Army and rescue helicopters have limits on ceiling and load in thin air. Heli Action specializes in high-altitude operations in the mountains. Its pilots know the terrain, know the limits of the machine. The crew's first task was to bring the living members of the group down off the mountain. Their condition required medical care in the shortest possible time. The second task was the evacuation of Rastorgev's body, but it was immediately recognized as extremely dangerous. The place of his death remained in a zone of possible repeated rockfall, and working a helicopter close to a sheer wall is always on the edge. The Federation of Mountaineering of Russia released a brief statement that same day. In it, what had happened was officially called a tragic accident. The wording was neutral, but for anyone familiar with the situation, it carried the essential point. This was not a mistake and not negligence, but the inevitable risk of wall terrain. It was exactly that risk that shaped the entire course of the rescue operation. Throughout the 27th and 28th of August, the Heli Action helicopter worked on the task of evacuating the two remaining members of the group. Ekaterina Fyodorova had sustained serious injuries. Her condition required immediate hospitalization. After being lifted on board the helicopter, she was delivered to a medical facility. According to public reports, there were no life-threatening injuries, but the nature of her injuries called for serious treatment. The second participant, physically unharmed, was also lifted off the mountain. His psychological state after what he had been through called for observation, but formally he was healthy. He was placed under care. The attempt to recover Rastorgev's body that same day did not succeed. The reasons were objective and plain. The zone where he died remained dangerous for rockfall. The helicopter could not hover near the wall without serious risk to the crew. Air currents along the wall are unstable, and a single large stone hitting the rotor turns the work instantly into a disaster. The director of the Bezengi Alpine camp gave a brief comment to the press that day. He spoke of the difficulty of the upcoming evacuation. In his words, the task required selecting a window of relatively calm weather and extremely careful work by the pilot. On questions about timing, the director answered with restraint. The operation was postponed to the following day, the 29th of August. All this time, Rastorguev's body remained at the point on the wall where the tragedy occurred. For his closest colleagues, this was in itself a separate heavy moment. A man of his stature in Russian mountaineering is never left in the mountains for long if there is any possibility at all of bringing him down. But the main rule of rescue operations, Rastorguev himself had repeated to his students for decades: you cannot add the living to the dead. His own principles that night worked against a quick evacuation. The crews were preparing for the next day. The district lived in anticipation of a window. The information went out to the mountaineering community of the country. Rastorguev was gone, the body was still on the wall, the operation was ongoing. The information that the operation was ongoing found its continuation on the 29th of August. The rescuers of the Elbrus High Altitude Search and Rescue Unit of the Emergency Ministry again went out on the task. The commercial helicopter was once more brought in, the same machine that the day before had lifted off the living members of the group. The mission was scheduled for a window of relatively calm weather. In Bezengi this season, such windows are rare. By the end of August, the wall lives by its own schedule. In the morning, it is colder. The wall throws down fewer stones. After midday, the sun heats the terrain, and the risk rises many times over. The task was to work in the first hours of the day. The rescuers reached the place where the group had stopped. Rastorguev's body was taken off the wall and handed over to the law enforcement agencies for standard procedures. The evacuation took place on the third day after the moment of his death. For Bezengi conditions, that is a realistic time frame. In such situations, faster work is only possible on the simplest terrain. The director of the Bezengi Alpine Camp, in an interview with the newspaper Izvestia, specifically emphasized how dangerous the operation had been for the rescuers. He said that only a handful of crews in the country were ready to work at such altitudes and in such conditions. Every approach to the wall was a real risk for the machine's crew. When the body was finally on board, the director publicly thanked the pilots and the men of the unit. The operation became one of the technically most complex evacuations of the 2025 season. In Russian mountaineering, cases like this are remembered for a long time, no less so than the ascents themselves. They become material for debriefs and then cross over into training programs. The irony is that for many years those very programs were shaped by Rastorguev himself. News of the successful recovery of the body quickly spread across the mountaineering community. For colleagues, that day closed the hardest part, the long wait while their comrade remained on the wall. For the family, it made it possible to begin the farewell itself. Rastorguev's body was sent home, to the Krasnodar region, to Gelendzhik, where he had lived most of his life. He was transported there in the last days of August. The funeral took place there. Colleagues came from the Krasnodar region, from Ingushetia, from Moscow, from various points across the North Caucasus. Those came who had climbed with him on the rope, who had built Kiazi, who had trained students on the certification course. The Federation of Mountaineering of Russia published an official obituary. The text listed all his titles: Master of Sport, Instructor Methodologist of the highest category, Senior Instructor Methodologist in Ski Mountaineering, Bearer of the Snow Leopard of Russia badge. His two key contributions of the recent years were mentioned separately: the construction of the Kiazi Alpine Camp in Ingushetia, and his work at the Federation's instructor schools. The listing came out long, even by the standards of biographical reference texts. For the Krasnodar region, Rastorguev's death was the loss of a symbolic figure. He was the man with whom modern mountaineering in the region had begun, from the organization of training camps to the training of young people, from participation in rescue services to personal ascents, closing every grade of difficulty. His departure left a void that cannot be filled in a single season. The date of his death, in his biography, reads almost literarily. On the 25th of August, 2025, he turned 68. On the 27th of August, 48 hours after his birthday, he died on Janga Tau. That short distance between the celebratory date and the date of death would be mentioned in publications for a long time to come. His departure entered the mourning calendar of Russian mountaineering for 2025, the year in which several well-known athletes were lost in the mountains. Among the old lions who never walked away from wall terrain, his name stands apart. The memory of him is built from concrete things. The line on Koshtantau climbed first. The walls of Kiazi where young athletes now train. Hundreds of instructors who passed through his school. 200 summits left behind. And the last route on the Bezengi wall, from which he never came back. In 2017, he said, "The price of this summit is life." In August of 2025, he paid that price himself. Nikolai Totmianin, 66 years old, 7-time snow leopard, winner of the Pyramide d'Or for the north face of Janu, the most famous Russian high-altitude climber of his generation. He was heading up Pobeda Peak, 7,439 meters, for the 8th time. He went during the season that the world would later call the hardest August in the mountain's history. In a single week, 6 people died on it. He reached the summit on the 11th of August, and on the descent, the mountain took what was hers. The story of a man who knew the law of Pobeda better than anyone, and still lost to this mountain. Nikolai Anatolievich Totmianin was born on the 8th of December 1958 in the village of Leninskoye in the Kirov region, and he lived exactly as long as his main mountain allowed him. On the 11th of August 2025, he was gone. He was 66 years old, and he died not on the summit, but after the descent, in a clinic in Bishkek, where he had been brought by helicopter. But everyone who knew Russian climbing understood at once. This was Pobeda, Pobeda Peak, his working mountain, which he knew better than almost any living person, took him on the same kind of day, in the same kind of bad weather, in which it had taken dozens before him. For the Russian Mountaineering Federation, this was not just the loss of a strong athlete. This was the passing of a living legend, honored master of sports of Russia, captain of the national mountaineering team, holder of the Pyramide d'Or, the most important international award in the mountains. He stood shoulder to shoulder with those who had carried an entire generation of Soviet and Russian high-altitude climbing on their backs. Behind him were more than 200 ascents. Around 60 times he had climbed above 7,000 meters. 7 times he had completed the snow leopard standard, a unique achievement for this title. As a member of Alexander Odintsov's team, he took part in the first ever direct ascent of Janu's north face in the Himalayas, 7,710 meters of almost vertical ice. In the narrow inner circle, he was called, quite simply, Iron Uncle Kolya. The nickname stuck to him long ago because it fit perfectly. He was calm where others grew nervous, calculating where others were hoping, and he came back from mountains others did not come back from. His death, when it finally happened, did not stun the community with surprise. It confirmed what he himself had been saying for years. Every great mountain has a price, and one day that price must be paid in person. He learned to calculate that price not in the mountains, but, long before, in an ordinary Soviet city. In 1972, the Totmianin family moved from the Kirov region to Leningrad. He was 14, and at that age many boys experience moving to a big city as a shock. Nikolai took it as a task. He enrolled at Physics and Mathematics boarding school number 45, attached to Leningrad State University. It is one of the strongest schools in the country for future engineers and scientists. The children live in a boarding school, study on a university-level program, and get used to a strict routine and to the idea that problems are solved not by emotion, but by calculation. This is exactly where the type of thinking was formed that he would later take with him into the mountains. In 1981, he graduated from Leningrad State University. His specialty was physical mechanics. That is work with materials, loads, deformations, with how different bodies behave under pressure and in various temperature conditions. At first glance, it is an office science. In practice, it is the ideal preparation for high-altitude mountaineering, where every rope, every grain of ice, and every knot lives by the same laws. At university, the mountains caught up with him. He became a member of the Bars Climbing Club at Leningrad State University, one of the strongest schools of Soviet high-altitude climbing. Bars was not a sports section just for show. It was a tough circle where people were taught to climb, rope together, to work with discipline, to analyze mistakes. This was not where you raised tourists. It was where you raised high-altitude climbers. Here he found partners he would climb with for decades, and a philosophy of the mountains that would stay with him to the end. Later, colleagues would recall, Totmianin was never a loud leader. He was the man who arrived first, left last, and whose opinion during a debrief was worth more than all the others combined. This manner did not appear in the Himalayas. It came with him from the boarding school and from the physics mechanics lab. With that kind of thinking and that kind of club behind him, he went into the mountains seriously. In 1984, at 25 years old, Totmianin climbed Pobeda Peak for the first time. That was no random choice. Pobeda Peak, 7,439 meters. The summit stands in the Tian Shan Mountains, on the border between today's Kyrgyzstan and China. It is the northernmost 7,000er in the world, and precisely because of this latitude, it has a special reputation. The winds and the cold here are worse than on many 8,000ers of the Himalayas. Oxygen is harder to tolerate at the same altitudes. The long ridge above 7,000 stretches for kilometers, and you have to walk it for hours, burning through reserves you barely have. The mountain became famous as a killer. Its overall fatality rate hovers around 30%, meaning that out of 10 climbers who reach the key sections, 3 may not come back. For a young high-altitude climber in 1984, this was not a heroic adventure, but a planned ascent within the framework of the Soviet mountaineering school. But Pobeda rarely lets you off lightly. His very first meeting with it became the point from which there was no going back. He returned and kept thinking about this mountain. For most climbers, Pobeda is a one-time test. You climb it once, you check it off, you move on. For Totmianin, it was different. Between 1984 and 2021, he would climb it 7 times. No other 7,000er would keep pulling him back with such persistence. Later, he would say, "Other mountains can be conquered once, but Pobeda demands that you come to it again. And each time you must negotiate with it anew." The community would remember that line. With those words, he would return there again and again, in the 90s, the 2000s, the 2010s, and for the last time, in August of 2025. But 1984 was the summer it all began. From that summer on, Totmianin began methodically building his own map of altitude. In Soviet mountaineering, there is a prestigious title, Snow Leopard. It is awarded to those who have climbed the 5 highest 7,000ers of the former Soviet Union. These are Pobeda Peak, Khan Tengri, Ismoil Somoni Peak, which used to be called Communism Peak, Lenin Peak, and Korzenevskaya Peak. All of them stand in Central Asia, in the Pamir and Tian Shan ranges. Each of these summits on its own is a serious test. Climbing all 5 during one lifetime is already considered a major achievement. For most climbers, Snow Leopard remains a one-time entry in their biography. You earn the title, and you live with it to the end. For Totmianin, it turned out differently. He completed the standard 7 times in a row. A 7-time Snow Leopard is a unique result in the entire history of the title. No other Russian climber of his public stature has such a number. And the point here is not about collecting. To pass all 5 summits 7 times, you have to return to the same mountain ranges for decades in different conditions. In summer, in autumn, by different routes, with different teams. This is methodicalness that borders on character. He knows the camps, the fern, the ice walls, and the approaches to these mountains like a district of his home city. He knows where the weather typically settles in, where cornices form on the ridge, and which trail is the shortest out onto the snow plateau. Altitude stopped being an obstacle for him and became a working environment. Many climbers, above 7,000, feel their brain switching off. Totmianin works at 7,000, not heroically enduring, but actually working, making decisions, assessing the group, running radio negotiations. This is what earned him the nickname Iron Uncle Kolya, not because he never got tired, but because he remained himself where others were already losing themselves. Staying himself at 7,000, Totmianin was bound sooner or later to test himself at 8. That opportunity came at the start of the 2000s. In 2003, he climbed Everest from the north. 3 years later, in 2006, he repeated the ascent, again on the same northern route, both times without bottled oxygen. That is an important detail, without which his biography does not read correctly. The north side of Everest is Tibet, a long, cold, technically difficult route. It has fewer commercial groups and much more responsibility for every decision. Without oxygen at 8,848 meters, the human body is working in a mode of slow shutdown. The brain gets 2 to 3 times less fuel than at sea level. Thinking slows down, simple movements become hard. Every step feels like climbing to the 10th floor with a load. The slightest mistake in navigation or tactics can cost your life, because there is no strength left for recovery. To do this route once without oxygen is the level of a very strong high-altitude climber. To do it twice is a level behind which, in the world, stand literally dozens of names. Totmianin is among them. He entered the narrow circle of Soviet and Russian climbers with 2 Everests without oxygen, and at the same time, he never turned either of these ascents into personal publicity. His Everest was simply another working summit, completed in the style in which he was used to working, clean, calculated, without theatrics. Publicly, he spoke about it sparingly, but the community understood what had happened. After 2 ascents like that, he stopped being just a strong, high-altitude climber. He became one of the people the young ones looked up to, and it was in that status that he was invited onto a project that would later change his name around the world. That project was called Janu. Janu is a summit standing at 7,710 meters in the Himalayas in eastern Nepal. In absolute altitude, it is not among the 8,000ers, but in world technical mountaineering, it is considered one of the hardest mountains on the planet. The reason is its north face. The wall rises almost vertically for 1,800 meters. It is a giant shield of ice and rock whose brow hangs over the glacier. No one had ever climbed this line. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the strongest teams in the world started eyeing Janu. The French, the Japanese, the Americans, all of them walked up to the wall, attempted it, and retreated. The weather, avalanche danger, technical difficulty, and altitude at the same time. That is a combination almost no one could handle. The direct north face remained one of the last great problems of the Himalayas. In 2004, a Russian team led by Alexander Odintsov took it on. Odintsov was an experienced leader, known for large projects. For several years, he prepared the Janu expedition. Scouting trips, team selection, equipment, logistics. A constellation of names from the Russian high-altitude climbing scene of that era came together for this project. Mikhail Bakin, Sergei Borisov, Gennady Kireevsky, Mikhail Mikhailov, Dmitry Pavlenko, Mikhail Pershin, Yevgeny Prelepa, Alexander Rushkin. Among them was Nikolai Totmianin. He was invited as one of the group's key high-altitude climbers. This was not a sprint ascent in alpine style. This was a months-long siege of the ice shield, by the rules of the old big school. The team planned to work on the wall like a large guild, fixing ropes, setting up camps, gradually working and securing the route. Everyone understood that such a wall could not be climbed in a single push. It required patience, reserves of food and fuel, proper rotation of groups, and iron discipline. Exactly in projects like that, Totmianin felt he was in his own element. He entered the expedition as a man you could rely on any section of the line, someone you could rely on, and someone who, when needed, would be the first to step forward. In the spring of 2004, the expedition deployed at the foot of Janu. A team of 10 began methodical work on the wall. Sections were completed one after another: rock bands, ice mirrors, cornices. Fixed ropes were hung upward like rails, along which groups hauled loads and gradually pushed the upper camps higher. This was grueling physical work, with no room for the shine of solo heroics. The main thing was not to break the schedule and not to lose people. Weeks passed. The group reached the upper part of the wall. Now they had to choose the final rope team that would try to reach the summit. Such a role does not necessarily go to the leaders, but to those who are physically best prepared at that exact moment and who best match the weather. 3 went for the summit push: Nikolai Totmianin, Gennady Kireevsky, and Sergei Borisov. On the 28th of May 2004, they climbed Janu's summit. In that season, Odintsov's expedition became the first in history to fully climb the direct north face. The 3 came back down to the upper camp, then lower, back to the team. Everyone was alive. For a big Himalayan project, that is a rare piece of luck. The expedition descended to base camp squeezed to the limit, but intact. 10 people went into the mountains, and all 10 came home. For Totmianin, this was the peak of his career, not in the numerical altitude, but in the difficulty of the line. He, a man whose altitude record could no longer surprise anyone, climbed a summit that no one had ever reached by that route before him. In technical terms, this was a leap higher than any 7,000er he had ever climbed. News of the ascent traveled through the climbing press all over the world. Western publications called the first ascent of Janu's north face the breakthrough of the decade. The Russian team had done what for many years had been regarded as something beyond the possible. Beyond the possible. That is not rhetoric. That is literally how the international community assessed Janu 2004. In the spring of 2005, the regular Pyramide d'Or award ceremony was held in Grenoble, France. That award is the main world prize in mountaineering. It is presented by a jury made up of the strongest climbers and journalists on the planet. Over all the years of the award's existence, very few have won it. Every year the jury chooses one or several of the best ascents of the season and names the laureates. In the 2004 season, the main prize went to the first ascent of the direct north face of Janu. Alexander Odinsov's team received the Pyramide d'Or. For Russian mountaineering, this was one of the biggest international recognitions in its entire post-Soviet history. Nikolai Totmianin became one of the award's holders. In the world hierarchy, this moved him into a different league. From now on, his name was not only domestic Russian, but international. He was mentioned in English-language mountaineering publications. His biography began appearing in foreign reference books. For many people in his position, this could have become a reason to turn their career toward commercial tourism, paid lectures, large sponsor contracts. The opportunities were there, but Totmianin made a different choice. After Janu, he did not disappear into commerce and did not lower the bar. He returned to what he knew and loved, to the working mountains of Central Asia, to Lenin Peak, Khan Tengri, and especially Pobeda Peak. To long siege-style expeditions, to guiding work, to rope teams with young climbers. The Pyramide d'Or did not change his way of life. He did not turn into a media figure with bodyguards and a microphone. He remained the same man, calm, engineer-like, focused. Only now, this man, on top of all his previous achievements, had the top prize of international mountaineering in his biography. And everything that was yet to come, it would come with that status. And everything that would come next, he built around one thing, passing on the experience behind his biography. In parallel with his sporting career, Nikolai Totmianin worked for many years as a high-altitude guide. He cooperated with the international company Asia Mountains, one of the major operators in Kyrgyzstan. The company takes clients from around the world to Lenin Peak, Khan Tengri, and Pobeda Peak. Totmianin became one of its key guides on the most difficult routes. For a guide of his level, this is a special kind of work. Clients who pay for climbing a 7,000er are rarely ready for that mountain 100%. The guide's task is not just to complete the route, but to bring the group up and return them home alive. That means constantly calculating the weather, the pace of each participant, reserves of food, oxygen, fuel. It means knowing how, at the right moment, to say no and turn a client back, even when he is desperate to reach the summit. Totmianin knows how to say that no calmly. His style as a guide and coach is not to pressure people with charisma, not to shout or stage any theater. He explains things in simple language. He shows young climbers how to read the color of the snow, how to understand the state of their own bodies, when you can keep going and when you have to descend immediately. He teaches them that the mountain is not an opponent you fight against, but the conditions in which you work. At debriefs after expeditions, he does not scatter loud words. What people remember are not flashy phrases, but his calm calculation of risk, which then stays with them for the rest of their lives. Many Russian high-altitude climbers of the 2010s and 20s passed through his hands or stood next to him on the peaks of Central Asia. For this circle, he became the benchmark of the working climber, not a poster hero, but a man you could go with safely. In the community, he was respected without reservations and without competition, and it was precisely out of that respect that his most famous public words would later grow. It was precisely out of that respect that his most famous public words grew, and they concerned one mountain, Pobeda Peak. In numerous interviews and debriefs after expeditions, Totmianin spoke about Pobeda more harshly than about any other summit. He never downplayed it. He never called it beautiful or noble. He called it for what it was. One of his phrases spread among climbers and in the press almost like an aphorism. The price of this summit is life. Another sounded like a safety rule. Pobeda does not forgive overconfidence. Young group members repeat these words before setting out. Instructors in climbing schools quote them. They appear in articles when readers need to be told how Pobeda differs from other 7,000ers. In 2017, Totmianin publicly formulated his main observation about this mountain. He spoke about what he called the devilish pattern. The idea is simple and frightening at the same time. Over decades of ascents on Pobeda Peak, almost mystical statistics have emerged. In virtually every active season, the mountain takes one or several climbers. This is not superstition. This is dry statistical observation over many decades. By that point, he had already climbed Pobeda many times and knew what he was talking about, not from someone else's words. He had seen that pattern in action. He had seen it triggered on other rope teams. He knows the places where the mountain breaks people most often. The long ridges, the snowfields above 7,000, the descent from the summit. When he spoke about the devilish pattern, he was not scaring people. He was warning them. He wanted those who came after him to go with full awareness, understanding what they were paying for. Later, after his own death, these words would sound as if he had spoken them about himself. But in 2017, he was still planning to return to this mountain. He would keep returning to that mountain to the very end. But the season in which he would come for the 8th time became one of the deadliest in Pobeda's history. The summer of 2025 unfolded on the mountain as a long chain of disasters. In a single week of August, Pobeda Peak took about 6 climbers, citizens of Russia, Italy, Germany, and Iran. The first major story was that of Natalia Nagovitsina, an experienced Russian climber around 47 years old. She set out on the route as part of a group. At an altitude of about 7,200 meters, a disaster struck. A broken leg at altitude. She could not descend on her own. Her teammates tried to help, but the conditions on the mountain left no chance of a full evacuation. The group had to go down. She stayed up there alone, in a tent, waiting for rescue. 2 independent climbers went up to help her, the Italian Luca Sinigaglia and his German partner. Sinigaglia was 49 years old. He was a long-time regular in the Tian Shan. The pair climbed up to where Nagovitsina was, delivering food, fuel, and warm clothing to an altitude of about 7,100 meters. On the descent, Sinigaglia's condition rapidly worsened, and on the way back, he was gone forever, from hypothermia and altitude sickness. Another pair of that same season was the Iranian team Hassan Mashadioglu and Mariam Pilavari. They climbed independently of other groups. Above 7,000, a snowstorm caught them on the ridge. Their last radio signal came from an altitude of about 7,300 meters. Then contact was lost, and no one would see them again. Rescue operations were thwarted by the weather, one after another. Helicopters could not climb to the necessary altitude. The mountain was closed off by wind and snow. All these events happened in one and the same week of August. News of the tragedies spread around the world in real time. World publications called it the hardest August week in the modern history of Pobeda Peak. And it was in that season that a group set out on the mountain with Nikolai Totmianin. The group with Totmianin came to the mountain when reports from altitude had already turned into a chronicle of losses. Despite that, he made the decision to go. He was 66 years old. This was his 8th attempt on Pobeda. By the standards of most climbers, it is a number at which people have long ago moved on to simpler summits. But Totmianin belonged to a different type. He knew this route. He knew the camps on the slope, the locations of crevasses, the places where the weather typically settles in. He knew his own limits better than almost anyone around him. In the community, people understood. This man was not going on an adventure. He did not set out on the mountain on a whim, did not chase numbers, did not yield to team pressure. The decision to go that season was the decision of an adult, calculating high-altitude climber who had made his own risk assessment. For him, Pobeda was not a line on a list. It was his working mountain. Each return was a conversation with it all over again. He went with a well-organized group. In it were people he knew and trusted. The tactics were thought through. The plan accounted for weather windows, satellite communication, an evacuation plan. He could not and would not ignore the tragedies of that season. But he counted himself among those who set out on the mountain with full understanding of what was happening. Perhaps this was his main choice. Many other climbers in that season could have turned back. Some did. But for Totmianin to decline meant admitting that at 66 he was no longer ready to have a conversation with Pobeda. And he was ready. And the community sensed that and respected it. No one tried to talk him out of it. This was his mountain, his story, and his boundary. The mountain had already opened its account for this season, and everyone climbing at that moment knew the price was still the same: one or several lives per season. One or several lives per season. On the 11th of August 2025, Nikolai Totmianin reached the summit of Pobeda Peak, 7,439 meters, a point he knew by heart. For him, this was already the 8th summit on this mountain. From 1984 to this day, 41 years of a relationship with one peak. He reached it together with his group. Everything was done by the book. The route was worked, the weather window was chosen, partners were close. At the top, everything went as planned. But right after reaching the summit, the situation began to change. Experienced high-altitude climbers know this moment. At the top, the body gets the final signal of the goal and switches gears. While you are going up, you run on adrenaline and concentration. As soon as the goal is achieved, the body begins paying off its deferred debts. For Totmianin, this switch came sharply. On the descent from the summit, the first warning signs appeared. The fatigue that experience usually suppressed could not be controlled this time. His muscles did not recover between steps as before. His breathing would not even out, even during halts. At altitude, his body refused to tap into its usual reserves. Age, the strain of decades, and the level of altitude all converged in one moment. The group saw the change in his condition immediately. In such situations, the count is in hours. The main thing is to start the descent at once. The lower you go, the more oxygen there is, and the greater the chance of recovery. You cannot stay on the summit itself. The partners made the decision to go down immediately and to accompany Totmianin with constant monitoring. He agreed because he himself understood what was happening. He built no illusions. He did not try to sit it out on the summit and gather strength. He did what any strong, high-altitude climber in his position would do. He started to descend. Every meter of that descent, from that moment on, would turn into an operation at the edge of the possible, for the entire group and for Nikolai Totmianin himself. An operation at the edge of the possible is what they all had to run. The descent from Pobeda Peak, even in good weather, is one of the longest and most exhausting in the world. It is not a short vertical line down which you can quickly shed altitude. It is a long ridge where you first have to traverse the entire upper segment of the crest, then come out to the camps, and then continue dropping altitude, down snowfields and an ice slope. All of this at an altitude where the air is thin, and any delay hits your health. Now the group had to take down their weakened partner. Totmianin was still walking on his own, but every step took effort. He gave commands, listened to advice, did not panic. But his body had already switched into a different mode. The partners worked in turns, belaying, guiding, supporting, distributing his load onto their own shoulders. Where possible, they let him rope together. Where the terrain did not allow it, they belayed him through anchors. The altitude would not let go. Oxygen was scarce, the wind on the ridge struck their faces, the shifts in terrain demanded constant concentration. On this work, the group burned through all the time reserve that had been set aside for the ascent. To save one, the team was willing to work at the limit. Totmianin held on through the experience and discipline that had built up over decades. He did not try to stand and walk on his own when he could not. He did not try to force sections when he needed to work slowly. He stayed composed to the very end, and it was precisely this that gave the group the chance to bring him down alive. They reached base camp. By that moment, the people's reserves were all spent, physical, psychological, altitude-related, but they made it. Totmianin was laid in a camp tent and given first aid. It became clear an immediate evacuation to the lowlands was necessary. He no longer had time for a slow route through the camps and villages. From base camp, a helicopter was called over satellite link. The helicopter arrived and picked up Nikolai Totmianin from base camp. This is the fastest way from the mountain down to the lowlands. The craft carried him across the Tian Shan ranges toward the Kyrgyz capital. In Bishkek, an ambulance met him. He was taken to one of the city's central clinics, straight to intensive care. The doctors began fighting for a heart that had worked for many years at extreme loads. 2 Everests without oxygen, 7 ascents of Pobeda Peak, the north face of Janu, dozens of other 7,000ers. Each of these ascents was a serious blow to the heart muscle, which a healthy body usually compensates for in youth and maturity. At 66, these debts start to come back. Medicine did everything it could, but at some point, the resources ran out. On the 11th of August 2025, on the same August day as his 8th summit of Pobeda, Nikolai Totmianin's heart stopped. According to the official statement of the Russian Mountaineering Federation, the cause of death was acute heart failure after returning from the mountain. He was 66 years old. He was in his 67th year of life. He did not die on the summit. His body did not remain on the mountain's ice fields. He managed to descend, managed to fly to Bishkek, to lie in a clean intensive care room. But, in some more important sense, Pobeda still took him. It did not let him go into old age, into peaceful ascents of small peaks, into guiding work on simple routes. It took him on the very day he, once again, came up close to it. His last summit was given to it to the very end. 7-time snow leopard, holder of the Pyramide d'Or, honored master of sports. On that day all these titles became part of the past. One fact remained: the 11th of August 2025, Pobeda Peak, a return from the mountain, a heart that stopped, a return from the mountain, a heart that stopped. Almost immediately after these words, his own long-ago quotes began circulating in the news across the internet. The price of this summit is life. That phrase is now recalled in every piece about his death. Pobeda does not forgive overconfidence. It is repeated in publications by Russian and foreign outlets. His formula of the mountain's devilish pattern, stated back in 2017, came true in him. And that is the central paradox of his story. Totmianin was not overconfident. On the contrary, for years he had been teaching others not to be overconfident. He knew the rules of the game better than almost anyone and played by those rules. His death was not the result of a mistake. It was the result of the fact that even the most experienced person, approaching a great mountain for the 41st year in a row, eventually exhausts his inner reserve. Age, altitude, and the history of loads stack on top of each other, and the mountain takes what it has come for every season. The climbers who were with him in the same season of 2025 acknowledged the bitter symmetry. The man who spoke of the devilish pattern became a part of it. The man who said, "Pobeda does not forgive overconfidence," died approaching it with maximum sobriety. And that is not a contradiction, but a confirmation. When a mountain itself is built in such a way that it regularly takes lives, even the most calculating player, sooner or later, finds himself in its zone. This is both the tragedy and the reason why the community takes his death without judgment. No one says he shouldn't have gone. No one blames the organizers, his partners, or the mountain. Everyone understands that the outcome Totmianin himself had spoken of for decades had come to pass. He knew the price. He did not hide it from others. And when that price turned out to be his own, he paid it, as he had been paying it mentally for many years. Without hysteria, without refusal, without bargaining. Without hysteria and without bargaining, the community saw him off as well. The Russian Mountaineering Federation published an official obituary almost on the day of his death. The St. Petersburg Federation and the Bars Climbing Club at St. Petersburg State University issued their own separate statements. On specialized platforms, on forums, in public groups, on blogs, dozens and hundreds of personal memories appeared. Rope partners, students, colleagues, expedition organizers, each wrote their own words. In those obituaries, the same words are repeated: reliable, calm, genuine. A man with whom it was not frightening to go into any mountain. A man to whom you could come with any question and get an honest answer, not a striking pose. International mountaineering publications, Gripped Magazine, Climbing Magazine, Explorer's Web, the Italian Alpine Mag, the Turkish Extreme, released their own pieces about Iron Uncle Kolya. They told Western audiences who this man had been and why his passing was an event for all of world high-altitude mountaineering. They recalled Janu 2004, the Pyramide d'Or, his 7-time snow leopard status, his guiding work. They called him a living legend who was no more. In a number of publications, a direct connection was drawn between his own words and his own death. For Russian high-altitude mountaineering, his passing is not just one loss. It is the passing of an entire generation. The generation that in 2004 did Janu. the generation that pulled Russian mountaineering up to world level in the 90s and the 2000s. These people are leaving now, one by one, some because of age, many in the mountains. Totmianin turned out to be among those who went into their own mountain. In St. Petersburg, they said goodbye to him in their own circle. In Kyrgyzstan, the guides and work partners remember him. In faraway France, where 20 years ago he had been presented with a Piolet d'Or, his name remains on the laureates' lists. He will not be crossed off those lists. He will not be crossed off those lists, nor from the mountain itself. After his death, August of 2025 is being finally written up as the deadliest month in the history of Pobeda Peak. Soon, the fate of Natalia Nagovitsina became known. She died of hypothermia high on the mountain, there where she could no longer be extracted. The Iranian pair Hassan Mashadioglu and Mariam Pilivari were officially declared dead. Their bodies will never be found. Luca Sinigaglia remains on the mountain. His body could not be brought down. All of this happened in 1 week of August 2025. Against this backdrop, the death of Nikolai Totmianin does not sound like an accident. It reads as part of the overall picture. Pobeda Peak, once again, reminds everyone why it is called a killer. It reminds not just one person, but many at once, of different ages, different citizenships, different climbing styles. And here the final question remains. The very one that Totmianin answered all his life. Why go there, knowing the price? His answer remains in his roots, in his students, in his rope partners. It remains in the quotations that young climbers now repeat before every season. It remains in how he himself walked his own path, methodically, calculatingly, without theater. Going into the great mountains is not a choice between life and death. It is a choice of how to live your life. For Totmianin, this was the only meaningful path. He walked it all the way. From his first ascent in 1984 to the summit on the 11th of August 2025, 41 years passed. That is exactly how long his conversation with one mountain lasted. And in that conversation, each of the interlocutors had the last word. The mountain said its word in the season of 2025. The man had said his long before. The price of this summit is life. And now that phrase is no longer a warning, but a biography. What happens when a man who spent 30 years pulling others out of the mountains suddenly needs rescuing himself at an altitude of more than 4,000 meters? On the 14th of July, 2025, on Pyramide Vincent in the Monte Rosa Massif, on the border between Italy and Switzerland, the heart of 63-year-old Pascal Strappazzon stops beating. Not a fall, not an avalanche, not a rope error, a routine ascent in perfect weather. A Frenchman from Haute-Savoie, one of the founders of the mountain firefighter group, GMSP 74, an instructor who trained generations of rescuers, and the mountain he had guided clients up dozens of times. The final story in the collection, Old Lions, the last season of the veterans of 2025. A story of how a legendary working summit gets climbed for the very last time. The 14th of July, 2025. Monday. In France, this is the national holiday, Bastille Day. In the small towns of Haute-Savoie, at the foot of Mont Blanc, shop windows are draped with tricolor flags, and the morning radio is on in the cafes. But for those who live by the mountains, this day looks like any other workday in the high season. Summer in the Alps is short, the weather is capricious, and every window of clear sky is worth its weight in gold. On this Monday, on the southern side of the Monte Rosa Massif, on the Italian-Swiss border, an ordinary ascent is underway. The target is Pyramide Vincent, a summit of 4,215 meters, one of the so-called sisters of Monte Rosa, one of the most accessible 4,000-meter peaks in the entire Alpine region. Beginners come here, and clients are taken here for the first time. Technically, there is nothing special about it. A snowy dome, a gentle ridge, a few hidden crevasses on the glacier. On the route is Pascal Strappazzon, 63 years old, a French mountain guide with decades of experience. A man for whom Pyramide Vincent is a working mountain. He had climbed it dozens of times, in different seasons, in different weather, with different people. He knew every turn of the trail, every ledge on the approach, every distinctive rock. The classic route for him ran through the Indran cable car, an overnight stay at the Nepal hut, and an early start onto the summit dome. The morning of the 14th of July unfolds as expected. The weather is fine, the sky is behaving within the forecast, the snow is holding. The group sets off at its usual pace. Strappazzon moves in his familiar role, out in front, controlling the rhythm, reading the mountain, no extreme conditions, no warning signs. It is a routine climb on a routine summit for him. So far, nothing is warning that this is the last morning of his life. The mountain does not tell you. The mountain never tells you in advance. The mountain does not speak in advance, and the man walking up its slope is usually a stranger to the outside observer. To understand what the French Alps are about to lose on this morning, we need to take a step back and look at who Pascal Strappazzon actually was. Formerly a French citizen, Haute-Savoie, Department 74. His name was tied to three small towns standing literally 20 kilometers apart: Saint-Gervais-les-Bains, Passy, and Sallanches. A narrow valley, steep slopes, the white dome of Mont Blanc visible from the window. For a man who grew up in a place like that, the mountains are not exotic. They are the geography of daily life. Professionally, a high mountain guide. In France, this is a separate, strictly regulated profession, guide de haute montagne. You can only earn that status by going through the National School of Skiing and Mountaineering, passing a series of exams considered among the toughest in the entire alpine world. Strappazzon went all the way through this path. In parallel with his guiding work, he held another profession: firefighter. In the French fire service hierarchy, his rank was adjutant, a senior sergeant. This is no longer a rank-and-file position. This is a man who commands crews and trains his juniors. And finally, a teacher. One of the historic figures of GMSP 74, the mountain group of firefighters of Haute-Savoie. An instructor in charge of training new rescuers. A cornerstone of IFREMONT, the Institute of Mountain Medicine in Chamonix, where doctors and specialists in high-altitude physiology are trained. All of this was one person: a guide, a rescuer, a mentor. Three roles woven into one biography. And all three roles were equally rooted in Haute-Savoie, the land that has been producing people who live between the valley and the glacier for centuries. That very land, the one that raises people between the valley and the glacier, has a name and its own very precise biography. Haute-Savoie, a department in the east of the country, wedged against Mont Blanc, against Switzerland, and against the Italian border. Here, at the foot of the highest peak in Europe, live the most famous dynasties of French guides: in Chamonix, in Saint-Gervais, in Megève. Here, the profession of a guide is hereditary. Fathers take their sons up their first ridges at the age of 10. By 15, the teenager already knows how to climb ice, how to drive in a snow anchor, how to read the movement of clouds over a pass. For a local family, this is not a hobby, it is a possible profession. The Saint-Gervais Guides Company, one of the organizations with which Strappazzon's name is professionally linked, was founded back in the 19th century. Its history is longer than that of many countries. Within such structures, an apprentice grows slowly, gradually earning the right to more difficult routes and more serious clients. The path from a tourist to a certified guide in France takes years. The National School of Skiing and Mountaineering in Chamonix, abbreviated as ENSA, is the state institution through which every future guide must pass. Its examination is considered one of the toughest in the world. Candidates are cut at every stage: technique, physical fitness, rescue skills, the ability to work with a client, knowledge of the legislation, practice. Strappazzon went the whole way. He earned the status of professional high mountain guide, the very diploma that stays with a man for life, recorded in a license with the tricolor stripe. From that moment on, he was no longer just a climber. He was a man carrying professional responsibility for the lives of those he led upward. That diploma is where his real biography in the mountains begins. A real biography in the mountains is still not the whole biography of Strappazzon, because in France, a mountain guide is rarely just a guide. This profession has a feature that most other countries do not share. Many French guides combine private work with clients with service in state fire and rescue structures. The logic is simple. Private clients provide seasonal income, but no stability and no social guarantees. Service in the fire brigade gives a salary, a pension, and a status. At the same time, it gives access to the most difficult tasks that arise in the mountains, to the real rescue of people whose climbs ended badly. Strappazzon chose exactly this path. He became a firefighter in Haute-Savoie. He went through professional training and certification, and he gradually specialized in what was most in demand in his department: rescue in the mountains and in hard-to-reach terrain. His work zone was the Mont Blanc Massif and everything around it: glaciers, rock walls, narrow gorges, high-altitude huts. The places where ordinary ambulance crews can never drive. Only specialized teams go there, with ropes, carabiners, evacuation stretchers, and sometimes helicopter support. Gradually, Strappazzon moved up the service ladder: a regular firefighter, then a junior commander, then adjutant, a senior sergeant. This was no longer just an executor. It was a crew instructor, a man who made decisions on the spot. The work is simple to describe and very heavy in substance: pulling people out of trouble, searching for the missing in avalanches, taking the stranded off walls, delivering bodies to places where their loved ones can say goodbye. For years, he went out on these calls across the entire Massif. Other people's disasters became his daily professional routine, with everything that accumulates inside a man from such a routine. Everything that accumulates inside a man who works in rescue eventually has to take shape. For Strappazzon, it took shape in a concrete institutional project, in a date that is officially recorded in French mountain rescue history: the 23rd of February 1993. The Departmental Fire and Rescue Service of Haute-Savoie, abbreviated as SDIS-74, creates a new specialized unit. The name is long but precise: Groupe Montagne des Sapeurs-Pompiers de la Haute-Savoie. The abbreviation is GMSP-74. In English, the Mountain Group of Firefighters of Haute-Savoie. The meaning of the project is direct. Ordinary fire crews are not designed for the mountains. They lack the equipment, the training, and the experience of working on ice and at high altitude. A separate group was needed, trained to operate where standard services could not reach: glaciers, walls, avalanche cones, hidden crevasses, remote huts, trails above 3,000 meters. Strappazzon is among those who stood at the origins of this group. In official texts, he is called initiateur, an initiator, a founding instructor. That is not a decorative word. It means a man who develops methodologies, trains the first members of the team, and writes the protocols for action on difficult terrain. In the early years, the new unit went through the natural growing pains. Equipment was lacking, funding was sometimes short, and the unit had to fight for recognition within the fire service hierarchy. But the work went on. The number of call-outs grew quickly. Rescuers of the mountain group began appearing at the loudest incidents in the Mont Blanc area. By the end of the 90s, GMSP-74 had become one of the most respected mountain services in France, and Strappazzon's name was increasingly mentioned alongside the name of the group, first as one of the leading field operatives, then as the chief instructor. Chief instructor is already a different role, different from that of a field rescuer. Strappazzon moved into it gradually, without abandoning operational work. One kept supporting the other. He still went out on complex operations, but he gave more and more time to training new people. GMSP courses are built to be tough. They are taken by active firefighters who already have basic training. Strappazzon and his colleagues add to that base everything that has to do with the mountain: rope work on a rock wall, evacuation of a casualty who cannot move, avalanche search using probes and specialized electronic beacons, the basics of high mountain medicine, how to recognize serious high-altitude conditions in a person at 4,000 meters, and how to act in those situations, orientation in fog, setting up a helicopter landing area on a glacier. Several generations of French rescuers pass through his courses. The young come in, the older ones retire, and the cycle repeats. But in this turnover of generations, there was one constant: the figure of the instructor. And gradually Strappazzon's name among mountain firefighters became almost a common noun. They say, Pascal taught us, and everyone understands. In parallel, he became one of the key people at IFREMont, the Institute for the Formation and Research in Mountain Medicine, based in Chamonix. This institute trains doctors, rescuers, and individual specialists in high-altitude physiology. Strappazzon was one of its permanent instructors for practical training. where theory from the lecture hall has to be turned into hands that know how to work on ice. He was one of those who ensured this transformation. Colleagues from the Institute would later say he had been a cornerstone of IF-Remont for many years. The phrasing is not an exaggeration. When hundreds of people pass through a school and all of them remember the same instructor, that is institutional memory. Institutional memory is not only a national thing. In the mountains, the border between states is often just a dotted line on the map that has nothing to do with the logic of a glacier or a ridge. Strappazzon worked from the very beginning with this direct understanding. Mountains know no borders. From this grew another of his themes: European cooperation in mountain rescue. France, Italy, Switzerland, Austria. All the Alpine states have their own mountain rescue services. Each has its own rules, its own equipment, its own language of radio exchange. In an emergency, these differences can cost time. And in the mountains, time is life. Strappazzon became one of those actively engaged in stitching together this European network. He took part in cross-border operations. When the Italian side of Mont Blanc needed French equipment, he was there. When Swiss colleagues asked for a joint debrief of a difficult case, he was ready to travel. When Grenoble or Chamonix hosted an international seminar on mountain rescue, he was on the program. Gradually, he became a familiar figure far beyond Haute-Savoie. Italian firefighters from Valle d'Aosta knew him by sight. Swiss rescuers from the canton of Valais knew him from joint exercises. In international training, he often represented France, and his name appeared on seminar programs alongside colleagues from other countries. For the professional community, figures like that are a support. They provide what cannot be written into intergovernmental agreements, but without which real cooperation is impossible. Personal trust, a common professional language, the knowledge that there is a man in the neighboring country you can call at 3 a.m. Later, in this biography, a bitter echo would come back. It was precisely on the Italian side of the Alps, among the summits he had worked on for years, that his path would end. A bitter echo in a guide's biography is rarely tied to a heroic summit. More often it is tied to the most ordinary one, the peak he knows better than anyone else. Every experienced guide has his own list of working mountains, the summits he takes clients up regularly, every season, sometimes several times a month. Pyramide Vincent in the Monte Rosa Massif was one of those for Strappazzon, a summit of 4,215 meters, located on the border between Italy and Switzerland, in a dense group of neighboring 4,000-meter peaks. Technically, this is one of the most accessible peaks in the Alps above 4,000 meters. No sheer walls, no difficult rock climbing. The main difficulties are altitude, weather, and the glacier. Everything else is a gentle snowy dome and a neat ridge. Because of this accessibility, Pyramide Vincent has long been the classic first 4,000er for beginners. Clients come from France, Italy, Germany, and Belgium. They ask for a guide who will show them what a real high-altitude summit is like, without demanding 2 weeks of acclimatization and complex technique. The classic route goes up the Italian side, a cable car ride up to the Indran Glacier, then a traverse of the glacier, a night at the Nefedi or Mantova hut at about 3,500 meters, an early departure in the dark, reaching the summit dome at sunrise. The descent is usually the same day. For Strappazzon, this scenario was routine. He knew every meter of the approach. He knew where the crevasses usually opened. He knew which clients he could push faster and which he had to slow down. He knew where to pause for a photo and where not to stop at all. Routine in the mountains is a dangerous illusion, and an experienced guide knows this better than anyone. But it is precisely on a familiar mountain that attention slips most imperceptibly. Pyramide Vincent, despite its reputation as a simple summit, occupies its own place in the memory of the alpine profession, with its own statistics. Every mountain collects them in its own way. For European guides, Pyramide is familiar working territory, but not toothless. In 2021, on the same massif, on the approach to Pyramide, 2 young Italian climbers died of hypothermia during a sudden snowstorm. Their names went across the Italian press. The story became a reminder, even a simple 4,000er. If the weather shifts in 5 minutes, stops being simple. Strappazzon knew these statistics. He knew them as a professional who, for decades, had been dissecting other people's cases in GMSP courses. He knew them as an Fremont instructor, explaining to doctors what happens to a person at high altitude during sudden hypothermia, and he knew them as a guide who was on that very mountain on a regular basis. He knew how it behaved at different times of day, how the snow conditions changed depending on the night temperature, where the zones with a risk of post-holing formed, how the wind behaved on the ridge, when the fog came in from the Italian side faster than from the Swiss. He knew how a client's body worked at 4,000 meters, when the person begins to slow down, when his head hurts from oxygen starvation, when you have to slow down and sit him down for a minute, and when, on the contrary, you have to force him to keep moving because a stop in an exposed area is more dangerous than walking. All this knowledge was professional capital, accumulated over years. Pyramide Vincent for him was not a challenge but a familiar training ground, a working space where he had already calculated all the ordinary risks in advance. It was here that he set out on the 14th of July, 2025, not on vacation, not on a personal expedition, on a routine, for him entirely familiar, working ascent. An ordinary working ascent on this particular day fell on a not entirely ordinary calendar. The 14th of July is the national holiday of France. In Paris, the military parade was running down the Champs-Élysées. In the Savoyard towns, evening fireworks were being prepared. For most of the French, it was a day off. For a guide in the peak alpine season, it was a workday like any other. The season in the Alps is short. The windows of good weather come irregularly, and clients book dates in advance without reference to the calendar. On the 14th of July, Strappazzon went out on the Pyramide Vincent route in the same manner he had done dozens of times before. All external parameters matched the standard picture. The weather was stable. The sky was behaving within the forecast. The snow conditions on the Indran Glacier were what you would expect in mid-July. The cable car up, then on foot across the glacier. Nothing extraordinary. There was no avalanche danger on the route, no deterioration of the weather, no technical reason to change anything. This is an important detail because on that day not one of the scenarios that usually appear in mountain incident reports occurred. No serac collapse, no sudden storm, no fall on a wall, no rope error. The pace of the group was moderate, matching the age and condition of the clients. Strappazzon walked in front, in his usual role. He controlled the rope team. He read the state of the glacier. He watched the clock to reach the summit before the sun softened the snow bridges. All of this was the very sum of hundreds of similar days in his biography. He had done every ascent exactly this way, calmly, methodically, with attention to detail, without hurry. And on the 14th of July, 2025, he was doing it for the last time. So far, nothing on the route suggested that the climb was heading toward a specific point after which it would no longer continue. The specific point after which the climb would no longer continue came somewhere on the approach to the summit section. Outwardly, it was not marked. No break in the weather, no change in the terrain, no alarm signal on the radio. What happened is what the protocols call sudden cardiac arrest, a medical event unrelated to climbing technique or to external conditions. The heart of an experienced mountain guide, 63 years old, at an altitude of more than 4,000 meters above sea level, simply stops working. And in the very same second, everything Strappazzon could do better than most people in the Alps became inapplicable to himself. At that altitude, emergency medical care loses effectiveness almost immediately. The air is thin, oxygen is scarce. Temperatures, even in July, rarely climb above zero. Any action by a rescuer takes 1.5 to 2 times longer and several times more effort than on flat ground. Standard emergency procedures under the conditions of Pyramide Vincent do not work the way they do in a hospital ward. Helicopter evacuation is possible, but not instantaneous. The aircraft has to take off, reach the point, find a landing spot, and hover over the slope. That is minutes, and in such a condition, every minute is critical. For decades, Strappazzon had taught rescuers this very arithmetic. He had repeated it in GMSP courses. The main thing at altitude is not the emergency procedures themselves, but the speed of decision-making, transportation, and the ability not to panic. He knew the formulas by heart. On the 14th of July, these formulas turned against him. The man whose work was the evacuation of others had himself become the object of rescue. And the procedures he had taught generations of mountain firefighters did not, this time, produce a result. He could not be saved. On the summit dome of Pyramide Vincent, hundreds of meters short of it, or on the ridge itself, at a point that open sources do not specify, his biography ends. The biography ends, and what in the mountains is called the aftermath of the event begins, the part that clients never see, but which is in fact the hardest for the colleagues. Open sources do not reveal who was next to Strappazzon at the moment of cardiac arrest, neither the name of the rope partner nor the names of the clients if they were with him. These details remained in the closed reports of the Italian Rescue Service and the French fire hierarchy. Only a short summary made it into the public sphere. The main facts are known. At that altitude, the clock ticks faster than the physical capacity of the people nearby. Even if they are other guides or well-prepared climbers, they are limited by the same altitude, the same cold, the same thin air. After that, the standard mountain evacuation procedure kicks in. A call to the Italian Rescue Service of Valle d'Aosta. A helicopter lifts off. A landing area on the glacier. Transport of the body down to the valley, where earthly formalities begin. A doctor's examination, paperwork, handover to the family in France. The Italian and French press received short statements. The Savoyard publication. Savoy pour tous ran one of the first extended pieces, under a headline referring to a distinguished guide and a historic figure of the mountain firefighter group. The international site Explorers Web would later include Strappazzon's name in its list of climbers and adventurers the world had lost in 2025. At GMSP 74, the news arrived almost immediately. In the mountain rescue community, messages like this travel faster than the official channels: a call, a message, a short text. For his colleagues, it was a double blow. A seasoned professional was gone, and a teacher was gone, a man through whose hands had passed the generations of those now receiving these calls. The mountain stays where it is. Pyramide Vincent is exactly what it was yesterday and what it will be tomorrow. 4,215 meters. The border between Italy and Switzerland. The classic route. The classic route remains, but the man who had led groups along it for years will no longer appear on it. In the Savoyard Press, on the 21st of July, 2025, the official obituary is published. The text is short, dry, in the form of such announcements. The name, the dates, the status, the place of the ceremony. The ceremony is scheduled for Thursday, the 24th of July, at 10 in the morning. The location is the church in Saint-Gervais-les-Bains, that same town at the foot of Mont Blanc with which his name is associated. After the ceremony, cremation in the family circle, without public continuation. On the social media pages of GMSP 74 and the national structure, GMSP France, posts appear with almost the same opening line. Pascal Strappazzon has left us. He will not come back from his last mountain. Hundreds of comments pour in under these posts. Colleagues from Haute-Savoie, from neighboring Savoy, guides from Chamonix and Saint-Gervais, doctors and instructors from Ifremont, neighbors from other countries join in, Italian firefighters from the mountain service of Valle d'Aosta, Swiss rescuers from the canton of Valais. These people knew Strappazzon personally through joint exercises, cross-border operations, international seminars. For them, the departure of the French colleague was a professional loss that did not fit into the abbreviation SDIS 74. The international site Explorers Web adds his name to its annual list of mountain losses. The wording is short: a French high mountain guide from Haute-Savoie, 63 years old. Sudden cardiac arrest during an ascent of Pyramide Vincent in the Monte Rosa massif. Behind that dry line lie more than 30 years of work in the mountains. The founding of GMSP 74, thousands of hours of courses, generations of trained rescuers, hundreds of clients to whom he showed real altitude, cross-border ties that will now be noticeably missed, and a very simple conclusion into which this entire biography collapses. All his life, he worked to pull other people out of the mountains alive. On the 14th of July, 2025, the mountain kept him with itself.